So, David, let's talk about your upbringing, your education, your mother and father, sort of your early education. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I was born in South Carolina in a small town, which was my mother's home. And my mother and father were married very young and were divorced after several years. My father's family were a large farming family. I remember rather flat land down there, and you could see houses about a half mile away in the distance, and every house was occupied by somebody with the same family name, the family, and it went on for some distances. After my mother and father were divorced, I spent a good deal of time with my grandparents and people of that sort. And I went to school in what had been a historically outstanding school in Winnsboro, a town called Winnsboro, which had the so-called Mount Zion Institute. It had become a public school by that time, but it was very, very good quality school. And I've always been grateful for that education, because unlike a lot of places in the South, it was very rigorous, and my elementary school training was excellent. I never found a school again, I think, short of MIT, that was equally challenging. When I was young, my mother moved to Asheville and remarried, and then I lived partly with them and partly with aunts and uncles in South Carolina. And they lived in Asheville, North Carolina. We lived there for a while. Went to Florida for the winter, and my stepfather liked it very much, so we moved there permanently. And I went to high school in Florida. We, in a high school there where it was a mixture between a country club and a country club high school, with a sort of a mixture of both populations. And I was far more interested in seeing that I got my football letter and joined the high school fraternity, which I did, and got the football letter barely. It was the kind of place where you were dating when you were 13 and you were driving when you were 14. And so we didn't have driver's licenses in those days. And I happened to be a very good student, but was anything but a nerd. My stepfather was not mechanical at all, and so I mostly played sports, and studying was incidental and fairly easy. And turned out I was as good or better perhaps in English and languages than I was in science and math. But the question comes, you had raised a question about further education.
I was just going to ask you, before we go to further education, do you remember a particular teacher who was influential on you?
Yes, I was just about to tell you that. People ask me why I went to engineering school, and the answer is very simple. My English teacher, where I had won some prizes in English, said to me one day when we were talking about schools with a group, she said, "You're very analytical. You should go to engineering school." I went home and told my stepfather that she'd said that. I'd had no particular thoughts about engineering. It sounded interesting. But I was anything but a nerd. I wasn't a radio bug of those days, and I didn't really do chemistry sets and father. And my stepfather was a very good driver, automobile driver, but he was anything but mechanical. And so we didn't do anything particularly mechanical around the house. And about the only thing was that I was very fond of erector sets, and I built a lot of that kind of thing, but that literally was it. So I went home and told my father that what had been said about engineering school by my English teacher. And he said, oh, well, if you want to go to engineering school, you ought to go to MIT. It's the best. And I really hadn't been quite that ambitious because it was a long way from Florida and expensive travel in those days. And I didn't want to be a burden to my parents, but so I applied to several engineering schools. Got in. I thought maybe going to Georgia Tech, but I got into all of them and went to MIT instead. I mean, as an example, and that's so basically I was in engineering school because of my English teacher, and and I had done at least as well on the languages side as I had in science and math, and I'd actually won more prizes on the science, on the math side, on the English side. But at any rate, I went off to MIT. When we had moved to Florida, I had come out of the Carolina high school systems, which were 11 grades. I got to Florida. I was in the proper grade for my age, although I had spent my early year or two on the farm on my grandfather's farm, and I was picking cotton when I was 6, and I learned to ride a mule when I was about 6, and we had several, what we called in those days, colored families. Now that was the polite term at that time. Now the polite term is Afro-American, of course, and we were taught to be quite polite about it. But I was picking cotton with them when I was 6 or so on my grandfather's farm. Though then going off to school, and I hadn't done anything really but summer camps and camp counselor and waterfront instructor and that sort of thing. Got into MIT, but my point was that when I went to Florida, they found I'd been in the 8th grade in Carolina, but everything I was taking in the 8th grade was what was taught in the 9th grade in Florida. So they advanced me a year and put me into the 9th grade, which in a way I regretted because I was a year younger than my classmates. The academic work was pretty easy, it was not a problem. And they were taking the same things I'd been taking in Carolina. But so I graduated at 16 and I was admitted to MIT and started there just after my 17th birthday.
What finally persuaded you to go to MIT?
Just, it was said to be the best school of the group, and I'd applied to Georgia Tech and Rensselaer and MIT, and I was admitted. I would have been admitted anywhere, and so I had been a bit of a disservice in that they gave intelligence tests and aptitude tests in high school, and I unfortunately did so well on those that MIT let me in, lacking a couple of courses I should have had. That was a big mistake because I walked into calculus and I'd never seen calculus. I walked into a physics course using calculus, which I'd only had a half year of physics and very weak chemistry courses. The science courses of my school were very weak, at my high school. So I had a bad quarter. I'd never seen a bad grade until that point, and the first 3 months at MIT were a rude shock, and took several months to catch up, and I was always quite offended by that because I ended up with an average record, but that was not what I was used to.
How did you overcome this, not having had calculus, not having been prepared for things like physics?
Work. Simple, sit down. I joined a fraternity, and it was Sigma Nu. It was an old-fashioned military fraternity. We had an old house in Brookline, Massachusetts, across the river from MIT, and they still had some military discipline theories, and it's said to be a military fraternity. And we had, I remember my first year, we had 5 people studying in a single room. So you had to have some rules. And so the seniors in the house wisely put in rules that after 8 o'clock, there was no talking, absolutely no talking in the rooms. If you wanted to speak to somebody about something, you went outside the room and talked quietly and briefly in the hall. If you wanted to listen to a radio, you went downstairs and you were explaining to the senior as a freshman why you were not studying. MIT gave quizzes alternatively on Fridays on physics and calculus, and those were very shocking results in the early stages, and the seniors watched these very closely. Well, so after we were, and those were days where hazing was very common and paddling was very common, and so if you behaved badly, you could expect a smacking. And I tell the stories to my children and grandchildren, and they simply don't believe it. But I wasn't too bothered by that. I'd also been in a high school fraternity where brutality was really made the college fraternity initiation seem quite subtle and quite clever. I remember in the high school fraternity, the night of final initiation, we were stripped to our underwear, required to raise our arms, and then a mixture of glue, crankcase oil, and sawdust was put under our arms, and then we were made to hold our arms against our sides until the glue had set. Then they put a rope around our necks in the dark and put us in swimming in the swamps down there, which were famous for having alligators. And then you were paddled until, when I went home, there were flecks of blood on my fanny. So I tell this to my children, and they simply don't believe it. So,
and this was considered fun.
That was considered normal, and you were expected to be able to take it. It made the Army seem easy. But at any rate, and it made the college fraternity seem, they had rather clever mind games and things in fraternity there. So at any rate, we lived in that disciplined environment, and I caught up, and several of us who had gone to poorer schools, a poorer academic quality school, were competing with the other students at MIT who had gone to very good prep schools, the New York State high schools with their Regents exams, or others, or had had a year of college, and they'd really had many of their first year courses. And this in itself was a trap, because the students felt, well, MIT's not too hard. Basically, what they found they were doing was that they were taking their last high school course over again very quickly and going very rapidly. Well, happily, they coached us the first year, and second year, those of us that had learned to work were coaching them. And after my first term sophomore year, I caught up, and it was not a problem.
You must have been, just as you explained, you were younger in high school because of this advancement by a grade. You mentioned you were only 17 when you went to college. Did that present any sort of social issues, or?
No, I found the MIT types were social retards. Remember, I was socially very advanced. As I said, we were dating at 13 and necking with 11-year-old girls, and we were driving at 14 and so on. So we were very used to dancing and parties and things, and so that part, the social part, was easy. It was just academics that were hard for a little while, and so no, that went very nicely.
And so MIT you found it to be a real meritocracy in that way.
Academically?
Yes.
Oh yes. Most of the people, or at least a very high percentage of the people, were what today you'd call nerds. Academically extremely bright, socially not very advanced. So I found that part of it easy.
What year was your freshman year at MIT?
1936.
Okay. Did you have any mentors or memorable professors at MIT that you recall?
Not in the early years. That was one of my, I've been a kind of an academic junkie all my career, in that I've spent a lot of time. I don't take college trusteeships because they take too much time, but my wife has been a life emeritus trustee at Carnegie Mellon, which was her school, and at Case Western Reserve. And I have served on, and in fact I'm still on, was on 3 deans advisory committees of business schools, though I never went to business school. And I'm now on 1 presidential advisory committee. And I spend a good deal of time supporting programs at several schools and very involved with them. And most students at MIT at the time, if they were involved, found it kind of a love-hate relationship. The school was so demanding at that point that, and worst of all, in my sophomore year, General Electric came and made choices for their cooperative training program. And at that time, General Electric offered a program where you, after the end of your sophomore year, you either went to school or worked in their plants around the clock, a typical cooperative program. While you were at their plants, you were given courses at night. While you were at school, you had some plant visits and things of that sort. The courses were, the getting into the course was tremendously prized because, remember, this was 1937 that this recruiting was being done, and the country had been through 25% unemployment, and we were all scared to death of getting a job when we came out of school. And getting into this course meant that you could, you were pretty certain of getting a job if you lasted in the course with General Electric. So the whole class tried out for it. One point I hadn't made was I went into mechanical engineering. Why? Because I was told it was the most general, which was about how much I knew about engineering. That was another of the things that I would change in life if I did again. I would go back to I would go through electrical engineering rather than mechanical, and I would have taken something that permitted more business courses. Our mechanical engineering professors were very good engineering professors. They were not very inspiring people. I've been invited on the visiting committee of the mechanical engineering department, but I didn't retain enough interest in the practice of mechanical engineering that I ever accepted that. So I've been actually on the advisory committee of the Sloan School instead, where I have an interest in the business aspect of it. But at any rate, it was a very intense academic experience, and 7 of us were picked out of a class of 70 or 80 for this General Electric program, and it was they regarded anything less than an honor rating as like flunking. So you pretty well had to keep your academics up. And I had gotten very interested in school activities, fraternity activities, and class politics and so on. And I ended up, I kept inheriting jobs rather than, I was elected vice president of my fraternity at the end of my sophomore year, which was proper. And the junior who was elected president, the president normally was a senior the following year, of course, was son of a rather rich man and had an airplane. And he did too much flying and too little studying. So MIT flunked him out. The result was, when they came back and had an election in the fall, and I was a junior and expected to be elected vice president again. Instead, they elected me president. And I had planned that year to take a scholastic overload, and I had a big academic activity job, a big activity job at the school. And I had not planned for an overload of all that, but I got the fraternity. Then I got in the fraternity, and it was my first business turnaround experience. I found that the previous president had spent down to where we had $11 in the treasury. We had no alumni support. We had a mortgage payment coming due on the house, and over the summer somebody had left a window open and the ceiling in the main hall was falling down. And rushing season started in 2 weeks. Well, I learned about how you turn around a defaulting business very quickly. We went down and bought some of this old-fashioned tin things that they used to put in very old-fashioned barbershops, and nailed it up, painted it over the falling plaster, then went out and recruited the largest pledge class in history to get the dues, so that we increased the revenue level, and we looked at all the costs and bought them out. And I'm happy to say at the end of the year, with no outside injection, we paid the mortgage. We were back in solid condition.
Did you see it as a turnaround at the time? Did you think of it as that, or?
Well, I was just desperate to save the fraternity, and you did what you had to do, which is what you do with when you're turning around a business. So so I'd inherited that job, really. Then the next year, I was the fraternity's candidate for president of the senior class, and the dorm candidate had more votes and worked harder politicking, and he got elected president. I got elected vice president. I thought, this is wonderful. I have all the honor and no work, and so I was prepared to enjoy my senior year and so forth. And guess what? He flunked out. And back in those days, MIT had a resolve that the tech is a place for men to work and not for boys to play. And they repeated that, and what was worse was that they meant it, and they enforced it. And so they flunking out the president of the senior class. They did that, so I inherited that job and had a little more work than I expected. But by then I was a pretty efficient student and didn't have a problem.
Which did you enjoy more, the academic side or the fraternity more social side?
Well, I had a pretty good time. I enjoyed, the fraternity provided all of a university experience that we had. I was very glad in one way that I lived in a fraternity, because I graduated with honors ratings, and so I got over the academic problem. I probably would have had better grades if I'd been in the dormitories, but life would have been much less colorful and interesting. And I had some lifelong friends out of the fraternity, and I had we were a very self-governing organization, and that was outside of camp counseling. That was the first leadership experience that I had, and leading a group of that kind, and particularly leading them through an experience where we had to cut costs and make some money and bring in people and that sort of thing, it was a business kind of experience. And the mechanical engineering department just did absolutely nothing to train in leadership as such. Had you asked them, they would have said they were trying to train technical leaders. That was absolute nonsense. The word leadership never came up. They were interested in training the best design engineers in the world, ready to start this afternoon. On my first job, jumping ahead a bit, my first job, for example, was that after I'd worked at General Electric, and after the World War II hadn't started. America wasn't in the war, but the war was here, and General Electric had a lot of defense business. And the demand for engineers picked up at that point. So everybody in my class got jobs in my course, got jobs very easily, because it was extremely easy to sell 2 degrees and a year and a half of General Electric training at that point, when people suddenly started hiring engineers after the period during the Depression when they'd laid them off. So we all got jobs, and the interesting part was that everybody was willing to pay a lot more for GE's training than GE was. So every one of us went to work for other companies, which didn't make GE very happy. But at any rate...
was that influential? Was your internship, your program with GE influential?
Oh yes. My first assignment at GE, one of the men that I had only a 4 months exposure to, but was the plant engineer, the head of engineering, power plant engineering at the Lynn Works of General Electric. And he was an MIT man, about 20 years out of school, a very good, very kind man. And they gave me to him as an assistant. And he did the best of all worlds. It then was that he just gave me all his little junk engineering jobs. And if he wanted a compressor moved from one installation to another and piped up and electrical calculations done and so on, he just said, go engineer that, plan it, plan the hookups, plan the electricity that needs, plan everything. Call the millwrights and have them move it, supervise it, see that it's started up and running and come back and tell me if you have any problems. And then, if not, come back and tell me when you're done. And I went off to do this, and the millwrights hazed me, and then, the old factory guys did. I was 19 years old, but I learned to handle that very easily and worked out, and it was beautiful. And on my lunch hour, I used to go down, and the welders would have left their equipment, so I taught myself welding on the job, that kind of thing. And everything was wonderful until one day, my boss was a very good man, very kind man. He was 20 years out of school, and he was as good in calculus as I was, and I just had the course. And he didn't seem to have lost anything, and I thought he was practically God. Then one sad day I saw his paycheck, and this was 1939, and he was making, GE had cut everybody back, he was making about what I hoped I'd make when I came out of school. And that gave me a serious prejudice against working for large companies. I've always objected to being underpaid. And I thought, if this is what a man as good as this is getting paid, this is no place for me. And then I subsequently had a couple more assignments at GE, turbine test engineering, where I actually ran turbines, and turbine research, and then I had a couple of months at Schenectady testing searchlights for the war test, which was the least useful of the courses that I had, and did some research there. However, when I got my first job, and then I went back to take my graduate year. When I got my first job, it was with a much smaller company. It was a wonderful time. I took 14 job interviews, and I think I had 13 offers. And the one that we didn't get an offer from didn't offer anybody because he found he wanted to pay far lower than the average that we were getting. Everybody valued our training. So I reported to this much smaller company, and it was involved in power plant engineering, and they said, we have to give you a training course. I said, naturally, I expected that. 9 o'clock in the morning, I reported. They pulled out the manuals and engineering specifications, went over the material with me, and I expected to be at this for weeks, maybe months, in the training and this. And 3 o'clock that Monday afternoon, they said, all right, you're trained. We have a customer up the street who's inquired about one of our smaller pieces of equipment. Go up there, call on him, engineer it, and bring back an order. I've never known whether they'd planted it or not, but I went up, called on the customer, took the engineering sheet along. He and I sat down together. We engineered the thing. He gave me an order, and I brought it home. I wasn't sure whether they'd sort of arranged the turkey for me to shoot and get me started, but that was my training program, and the next morning they threw me out on the street.
And that concluded with your first sale.
That concluded my first sale and my first engineering job, and from then on it was do the job.
Now let me be clear about the sequence, David. So you left, did you leave MIT and then take a job and then go into the Army? Was that the sequence?
Yes.
Okay.
MIT had a compulsory 2-year ROTC program, which everybody had to take, and then you volunteered for the second 2 years, which I did. And I was in the Corps of Engineers option. So when I graduated in June of '41, I was given a second lieutenant's commission in the reserve.
And clearly the war was coming.
Clearly the war was coming, and we were expecting to be called to active duty. In those days, you were being called for a year, but everybody felt that was a joke, that we would, and believe it was. And then I was called to active duty, coincidentally, the day after Pearl Harbor. It looked very patriotic, and I've always said if I wanted to make a good story, my war was that the day they started fighting, I volunteered. I was in the day after Pearl Harbor, and I was in Africa and Italy, and I was actually sent home on rest and recuperation the day the war ended in Europe on a 45-day leave. I can say that if I want to tell the story, if they're fighting, I want in it. When the fighting is over, I come home. I don't want to fool around with this sitting around in peacetime. Actually, it was pure coincidence on every count. I came home the day the war ended, actually, because I was in a big poker game in Casablanca, and I missed a call to go back to the States because the noise level was very high, and they were calling for my flight. And I got up about a half hour later and found I'd missed a flight back, and took some tall explaining to them to avoid me having to spend another month. And I was able to convince them. They hadn't posted it. It was very noisy in the officers' club. Actually, I was a big winner in the poker game. I didn't want to leave, but I didn't know I would not have missed a flight home intention. Those are, as I told you earlier, there's a good reason for everything, and there's a real reason, and I'm giving you the real reasons. So I missed a flight home because of a big poker game.
Now, you had a real taste of the private sector before you went into the Corps of Engineers. Were you happy to be going into the Army Corps of Engineers?
It was the best thing in the Army. I was very nearsighted, and I couldn't have passed the eye exam for a pilot. So flying was out of the question. I might have been interested in that if I had been able to fly. I mean, I had every boy's interest in flying, and the fraternity president that had flunked out had a plane, and as I said, needed too much flying, and I flew with him occasionally. And I'd had 3 or 4 lessons in flying. And then during the war, we were assigned a plane in a later headquarters. But that's later in the story if you want to include that. But at any rate, military engineering is essentially civil engineering, really, but it's very simple for a recent graduate. And the Army, when I was called to active duty, it looked like a general mobilization because the orders that I received had pages of people being called to active duty. So you look at that and seeing, dozens of officers were called up on the same thing. And then I learned the afternoon of December 7th, I heard about Pearl Harbor, and I was actually meeting with my old roommates in New York. We were having a final celebration before I was going to active duty, and another one of my roommates in graduate school was going up a little later than I, and eventually 3 out of 4 of them were in the service. But I kept waiting for news we couldn't believe the Japanese would attack America. It was in the attitude of America then was such a superiority complex toward the Japanese that we found it just incomprehensible. They do what they did. We had no idea of the relative strength of the Japanese Navy in particular at that point, that they could bring off a raid on Pearl Harbor. And we had no idea that the leadership in Pearl Harbor would be so foolish as to line up all their battleships, and as they were, and be lucky they weren't caught with their aircraft carriers. So we kept waiting for news that the Japanese fleet had been sunk on the way home because we thought America must have been prepared for this, and the word never came. So I was ordered to Langley Field to this prototype military unit. The 21st Aviation Engineer Regiment was the first regiment that had been converted to service, particularly build and service, maintain and defend airfields, demine, clear. If necessary, we were equipped with 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns and machine guns, and we had a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. We were not a combat engineer unit, but we had pretty much the same training, and we very much expected to do mine clearing, and we were prepared for combat if we'd caught it. And the only significant, I have 3 combat zone stars, but for having been in combat zones, but nothing fell closer than about 100 yards to me, and I was very lucky. And we built airfields, and the Army was a tremendous leadership experience.
How soon was it that you were sent to North Africa?
Just over a year, just about a year after I was brought in the 21st Engineers at Langley Field. Originally, I was assigned as an assistant regimental engineering officer, which was exactly where I belonged. And it was a staff job, and I was enjoying it thoroughly. But the trouble was that 2 months later, they changed me to the regimental. They promoted me in a job in that I became the head of the so-called intelligence survey and drafting function, and had my own unit. And I had 4 months of that, and then the way the Army expands in wartime is that they take a unit such as ours, which was a peacetime regular Army, and made up of very experienced people. And they pull the most experienced people out and put them in charge of the new units. And a company commander in a regular Army unit should be a West Point graduate with 3 to 5 years of experience as a platoon lieutenant, in charge of a platoon of about 50 men before he heads a company of about 170 or 80 men. That's what you should be if you're to be qualified. They took those West Pointers out and made them battalion commanders of new battalions. They took their most experienced troops and sent them out to cadre these new units, and they were expanding hugely. And we were just one unit. They just picked us clean. They took my class, which we had at that point 6 months, and they made us the company commanders, replacing these West Pointers without a day of company duty in our lives. And we suddenly found this has influenced my thinking on leadership tremendously, because suddenly I had gone from a staff officer doing engineering work that I was overqualified for into running a company of 178 men with not a volunteer among them, not a person that wanted to be there, not a regular Army person. They gave me 8 people that had been in the Army a few months, and these were my cadre. They gave me a guy who'd been a fat cook and he was my mess sergeant, and they had a whole series of this kind. And if possible, and it would be hard, these people knew less than I did, and I knew nearly nothing about this. So I went to my officer's manual that we'd had 4 years of, and I looked up leadership in it. And we have a half page of glittering generalities that are absolutely useless about how you deal with these troops. And people like to feel that the Army is a place you can order people to do things. Well, when you have the huge amount of command experience that I got before I got through, you learn that it's one thing to give an order, it's another thing to get it carried out. And particularly when you say, go clear those mines, go and get yourself out there where you may get shot, and get this done, and without them dogging it or avoiding. This is a different story. So, and then of course, as we got overseas, we found the further thing that ordering was fine, but many men would have preferred to be in jail, because being in jail was safer than being where you might be in combat. And if you were told to give engineering troops hard labor, now if you take infantrymen or other units and make them dig ditches, that's punishment. But engineer troops dig ditches for a living. That's what they do. I mean, we were digging ditches and moving steel landing mat, and that's what they had to do. So we were having to find that kind of problems. Well,
so how did you deal with that, this leadership issue, when you had so little background in it?
By guess and by God. You just figured out, what do? You work out for yourself how you tell the people. And I'll tell you a little more stories in regard to that. Well, fortunately, it depends. Leadership to some degree is about character. It's what you believe, what your value system is, and your willingness to do things by the book. And so I developed a philosophy of, I told my men, we're here to do a job. First of all, we're going to carry out our missions. You, as a leader, you've got to be absolutely, your men have to feel you are absolutely implacable. You're going to carry out the mission over their dead bodies or over your dead body if need be, but the mission is going to happen. And then, but to personalize that, to put the humanity on it, I said, if you do that, you cooperate, I'm going to do everything I can to get you home in one piece, not killed, not wounded, and do everything I can. And I'm going to do everything I can to make your life here as less bad as it can be. There's no making it good. But I'm going to see that our cooks do the best job in the regiment. The colonel was smart enough to start a competition between the mess halls, and little things like this that, when you're, one of the things about humanity that people just don't realize in this country, but when you're in privation, how well off you feel is relative. If you're miserable, but the guy next to you is considerably more miserable, you feel relatively well off. And so Army food is bad, but if you clearly can see you're getting the best food out of 13 mess halls in the regiment, then if you win the prize for the best food, then you feel relatively well off. Well, I saw to little things like that in terms of the welfare of the men. What happened was that about the fourth day that I got this new group of my men, I called this, they burned pork chops. And I called in the mess sergeant, this fat Polish guy that was had been a cook for a few months in the Army and got promoted to running a mess. And the Army calls it a mess, and in the other connotation of the word, it often is. And I was used to good food at home. My mother could not cook, but she had a real talent. She was a Southern girl, and she had a real talent for finding little Afro-American girls and making extremely good cooks out of them. And my father was very fussy, so I was used to good food. And our fraternity had quite good food. And so at $1.08 a day. I can't tell you what I paid for lunch yesterday, but I can tell you what I was paying for lunch in college as such. But we got to, so I called the mess sergeant in, Sergeant, they burned the pork chops. Well, sir, you know how it is with Army cooks, he said to me very politely. And there's a legend in the Army, I don't know whether you had military experience or not, but in the Army of that time, cooks were kind of a special breed. They were always troublemakers. They were excused from guard duty and excused from digging latrines and all the unpleasant jobs that everybody else shares. And they got drunk, and somehow even regular Army officers they kind of dominated. Well, I'd heard that. And I said, no, Sergeant, I do not know how it is with Army cooks, and I do not mean to learn. You tell them that they're in here in the shade and cooking, and they're spared a lot of unpleasant work. If I get the pork chops burned again, the cooks are going to be out in the June sun at Langley Field laying steel landing mat, which is about as hard and heavy work as you can find, and digging ditches. I said, any fool can cook better than this. The quality of the food went up drastically, and I only had to do that once again in Italy when they were throwing food at the men, and they were just slopping it into the plate. And I told them they were quickly going to be out on a mountain digging ditches in the rain in an airfield there. That's got stopped very quickly too. But you do that kind of thing. I never let our officers were always required to eat from the same food containers the men did. We sat at a different table, but they ate where the men could see them taking the same food. And however bad it was, the men saw the officers were doing it. No officer was ever allowed to go to bed before the men were all housed and in bed and taken care of. And we just saw to that. And so I ran what was considered the strictest company in the regiment, and I got feedback to this extent from my colonel, because we were considered very strict, but morale was quite high because the men felt they were taken care of. They felt I was fair. They felt I was tough, but I was fair. And one day the battalion commander called me in and said, "Morgenthaler, I'm going to make you a defense counsel." You know, the Army runs summary courts and special court martials, and can give sentences that are run with as a second duty with officers. Am I getting into more detail?
No, this is fine.
You want this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So at any rate, the colonel said, "I'm appointing you as a second job, as a sideline. You are defense counsel for." And I said, "Colonel, I don't want that job. I have no sympathy for troublemakers and people that are in jail, need to be in jail and so on. I don't want to do that job." He said, "I don't care, Morgenthaler's orders, do it." I said, "All right, sir, but you're not going to like it." "What do you mean?" I said, "Your other company commanders are not doing a good job on their court-martial, and the men are losing respect for authority. They're losing respect for the fairness of our military system." I said, "I have never court-martialed a man. I court-martial fewer men than anybody else does, but anybody I court-martial is always convicted. He is guilty, and I can prove it. And I do not send him up there, even if I know he's guilty. If I can't prove it, I don't send him because he loses respect for the court." And I said, "The rest of your company commanders, your other three, they have troublemakers. We all, in any 200 men, you'll have of that kind, you'll have 5 to 10 real troublemakers. And they're just, well, I learned some rules about humanity that I've used in business ever since. One is that about 65% of the people you run into, everyday people, tradespeople, everything, they're good people. They make some mistakes. You may get a little minor cheating or something like that, but they're very minor, and they really want to do well, and they want to stay out of trouble. About 25 or 30% more don't start trouble, but they will be easily led into it. They're the people that said, if somebody says everybody cheats on their expense account, so they cheat on their expense account because everybody does it. Everybody tries to avoid the subway fare. Everybody does it, and then you end up with 5 or 10 troublemakers that will start the trouble, and you find this, and it's just a rule in humanity. For instance, you can trace it right back to this last episode in home loan mortgages. What these people did in Wall Street, and it's unforgivable, is that they preyed on that 25% of people who were making the liar's loans, who were told it's all right to lie about your income because everybody does it. You're going to be bailed out because the house price is going to escalate. It's all right to pretend something that we don't have here. Everybody does it. And that 25% are led into it, and they were led into it, and that has been, those loans have been the kind of thing. If everybody had done what you or I would have done, is if I'm going to take out a loan, I'm making very sure I can repay it. If I can't repay it, I won't take it out. But these people said, well, he said I could pay it, so he knows more than I do. I know somehow I'm cheating. But well, you have that 25% in the Army when you're commanding it. And so that's a lesson I learned in this period.
And then did you develop a technique for each one of those percentage groups? It sounds like you did, if you identified them.
Well, I took over, jumping ahead a little bit. I had been, well, the incident I wanted to tell you that Gary has heard, the colonel appointed me defense counsel, and I just simply went in and did, the Articles of War are very simple. I mean, it's easy to be a military lawyer. And I had one law course in college, and I did pretty well in it. And although it probably says something about my character, the professor was another person that I thought well of. He said, he called me in once and he said, Morgenthaler, I have to give you an honors grade but I've never given you a perfect paper. And he said, the reason is that you turn in a perfectly reasoned legal paper holding exactly the way the minority opinion of the Supreme Court does. He said, can't you ever argue with the majority? He said, I have to give you honors if you can argue exactly like a Supreme Court judge does, but why must you always pick the minority of it? So I got honors in the course anyway. But so I just made these guys prove their cases. We got a lot of people that were guilty acquitted, and I knew they were guilty, but the point was that you've got to respect the law. I mean, you've got to feel that you are guilty, you are innocent until you're proven guilty. And if people believe that, then, and these company commanders would just get sick of the troublemaker, and they'd, and without thinking too much about it, he'd been in 4 or 5 things and were trouble, and they'd give him company punishment, and finally the company commander, he'd do something, the company commander would get sick of it and court-martial him. And sometimes he wasn't guilty of what he was accused of. Never could they, I mean, often they couldn't prove it. And so then the man was court-martialed, and he felt unjustly treated, because so I started getting a lot of people acquitted, as I told the colonel I was going to do. And I got to the point for a while there where any troublemaker, any real 8-ball, any bad guy in the battalion would go 100 yards out of his way to say good morning to me, because he thought I was going to end up being his lawyer somewhere along the way. And the nice people wouldn't speak to me. So we had that incident. But then later on, when I first went into Africa, I was given a remote assignment to build an airfield, and turned out pretty well. And so they got to trust me with it distant. And a company commander of an engineer unit in a primitive area in wartime, away from headquarters, is a little tin god. He is the boss. Regimental headquarters was 100 miles away over bad roads with no telephone connections, no radio connections. If you saw somebody from headquarters once a month, it was frequent. And they wanted you to build an airfield, and the instructions were practically, they'd come down, somebody from staff would come down and say, we want you to build an airfield, 10,000-foot field, that direction, start here, go 10,000 feet, put it in business. When it's operating, come back and tell us. Those were about the extent of the instructions. I love that.
It sounds like your GE experience.
That was like my GE experience on a much bigger scale.
Yeah.
So at any rate, I'd been used to being very away from these, and then one day I was called in by the same colonel that had made me that. He said, Morgenthaler, you're going up to command the headquarters and service company. I said, oh, I don't want to do that. Said, I've been used to being 100 miles away from the colonel and running my own show and so forth. I do that, I'll be sitting about 100 feet from him, and I'll have nothing but brass breathing down my back all day, and I'll be paying attention to a lot of staff junk. I'm a line officer, and there's a funny attitude in the military. You get it, and I had been originally very disappointed when they made me a company commander. But a company commander is a line officer, and I'd been a staff officer, which is much easier if you're qualified for the staff function. But then when you really run a unit, and when you, as I said, you get to feel like you're a little 10 God, and if you've been successful at it, and I was, then you feel a little superior to the staff people, and they somehow also recognize that they're just not sure they could lead this group of troops and make them do what they had to do. But if you've done it, then you get a certain attitude of command that you probably never lose. So Colonel said, don't care, orders, go. So I walked up, drove up, moved up, walked in, reported, saluted the colonel, Captain Morgenthaler, reporting his order for duty as ordered, sir. He said, Morgenthaler, I hear you're the toughest company commander in the regiment. This headquarters and service company is all blanked up. He did not say blanked. Straighten it out. That's all. Those are my instructions. I said, yes, sir. Saluted about face and went out. He was right. It was all blanked up. It was very easy to straighten out because these were staffy type people, and they were just not used to the hard realities of the line. And I got them together and gave them a little talk, and I said, this is called the headquarters and service company of the regiment. You have the cream of the people. You have the best equipment. You have the most equipment. You're the largest company at about 300 men. I said, your job is to give service to the line companies. I have been a commander of a line company for a long time. I've experienced your service. What you are is all headquarters and no service. I said, we're going to change that. These guys are out there in tougher living conditions, doing a hard job with less equipment and less trained people than you have. You're going to service them, and I'm going to get reports back from them as to how helpful you are, or there will be consequences. I said, in terms of, I didn't bring you over here, I don't have the authority to send you home. If you do your job and carry out them and get the missions accomplished, I'm going to do everything I can to get you home in one piece, alive, and I'm going to do everything I can to see you live as well as we can here. If you don't, I am going to don't feel that everybody's going to get treated alike in the company. I don't treat people alike. If you help me and really do this job, I will do everything I can for you. You give me a hard time, I will do everything I can to you, and that is quite considerable. So if you want grief, just give me grief. If you want a happy life and the best we can make out of this miserable situation, we all want to get home, just help. And I said one practical thing. The regiment lets one man a month go home from the company. The company commander selects that man. We have seen, and you all know about incidents where somebody made himself so objectionable that the company commander, who couldn't get rid of him otherwise, and remember in the Army you can't fire them, you are allowed to, so he'd send him home. I said, you can be absolutely certain that will never happen here. You will have a long gray beard before you go home if you give me a problem in operating this. Well, I was told, and it showed the morale just went straight up, because all the good guys suddenly thought it does pay to, I put an incentive in being a worthwhile performer.
And do your job.
And I put a little fear of the God into the others there, because most of them were convinced that I was meaner than they were. And so that was part of it. And we had We had interesting, but it was also a show of loyalty to your troops. So we had one case where, again, I may be taking too much of your time on this, but
one more story, and then I want to ask you a question about the Army, and then let's move on to your post-war career.
Well, the last story was, we, as a headquarters and service company, you put men out on assignment to other officers. We, fairly late in the war, we had quite a good colonel, the second colonel we had, not the one that had told me originally. And that guy originally who gave me the company all blanked up order, later became Chief of the Corps of Engineers. He was 37 years old. I was 24. Damn wonder we won the war. But then this later, and he had moved on, he'd been transferred or promoted somewhere. We had another quite good colonel generally. But some of my troops were assigned to a young lieutenant who took them up very near the front and bivouacked them in an abandoned house and had some trouble with his men and came back. And the first, I mean, they were my troops to command, but his assigned them for duty. And came back, and the first I heard was that the colonel called me in and said, I want these men, these two men court-martialed. I said, what for? And he said, well, the problem with their lieutenant, and he's charging him with looting. I said, looting? Colonel, that's the silliest charge. I mean, we'd been in the war a long time. We'd been through the whole African charge, and we'd been through the whole Italian campaign at that point. It was getting late in. I said, that's the silliest charge I can think of. I said, where do you think we got the piano in the officers' mess? We looted it. Where do you think we got most of the furniture? We looted it. Where do we think most of the nice things we have? We looted it. We're all looters. You want me to court-martial my men for looting? What did they loot? Well, they looted some cheap little scarves, the kind of thing you'd buy in the dime store here for practically nothing. And there were millions of them in Italy. It was one of the few things around there. Well, I said, well, who would bother to steal those in the first place? But how did we know they did them? Well, they were in a room in this abandoned house that these guys were staying in. And he said the lieutenant put the room off limits. And these scarves were in that room. And these scarves were found in their packs afterward. I said, were they seen in the room? No. Did anybody see them take them? No. Have you any proof that those scarves came out of that room? No. I said, how do you possibly think you can make that charge stick? I've been a defense counsel. You can't make that charge. And so I called my first sergeant and I said, find out what happened. He said, sir, they're all, and when he checked around and talked with the men, he said, they're all looters, including the lieutenant. They all were stealing things. This is just a fight between the lieutenant and the men. So the colonel, so I went back and reported to the colonel. I said, Colonel, this is not fair. I'm a troop commander. My men look to me to look after them if they're being mistreated. This would be a mistreatment of these guys. No, I want them court-martialed. He got stubborn on it. I said, all right, so if you court-martial the whole group for looting, including the lieutenant, then I will charge my men. Oh, that's ridiculous, I won't do that. So they're going to be court-martialed. I said, all right, sir. It's not a lawful order to tell me you cannot force me to court-martial them. And I've got to command the respect of my men. And if you make me court-martial them, if you court-martial them, you'll have to get somebody else to sign the charges. Furthermore, I will volunteer to defend these men. If they want me, they don't have to take me, but if they want me, I'll volunteer to defend them. And if I defend them, I guarantee they'll walk out free men. And you're going to look silly. Garbage, out. So he got somebody else. The men, we went to the men and we said, we're not asking you whether you're guilty or not. We do not think this is a charge that should have been brought. And we protect our men when we think they're being unfairly treated, and we think this is unfair. So I will defend you if you want. One man wanted me, the other man wanted his boss, and they wanted to try it together. We tried, and this was a general court-martial too. This was higher than I'd ever done before, and it could have ordered them shot. It wouldn't for that, but I mean, the court had that much power. It wouldn't do it for that kind of thing. But at any rate, 35 minutes they were acquitted. They were free men. The colonel, bless his heart, we walked out together, and as we walked out, he says, "God damn you, Morgenthaler, let's go have a drink." So we had a drink and forgot the whole thing. But I mean, that's what you do with if you care about your men. Enough stories. That was what I got out of the Army experience. But you run a group. You have to run a group. You have to. And I developed certain theories, and I spent an hour last week on the phone with the dean because I'm supporting the leadership program at MIT, because I'm tired of the Harvard Business School, and I have probably 6 partners from the Harvard Business School, and some of them varying degrees of leadership. I'm tired of their assuming they are the automatic leaders of the world, and that you, I don't know whether you went to Harvard or not.
I went to law school there.
You did. Well, the business school,
Yep.
and they inculcate the attitude of you are the natural leaders, and they vary. I mean, some of them are wonderful, some of them are not. But the attitude is they should lead, and we want to put your MIT men, we'll lock you up in the closet and let you crunch numbers, and you will, and pay you well, and so forth. But we are ordained by God to lead. I just don't believe that. So I'm working to fund, and I partly fund, and am doing more funding of the leadership program at MIT.
Let me ask you one final question about your Army career.
Sure.
Did you ever consider staying in the Army after the war was over?
I'm glad to say I was one of the few people offered a regular Army commission. They offered me a captain's commission to go in the Army. This was in Italy. I thought long about it because the regular Army people got the best jobs. And at that time, it looked like the war was going to go on for a long time. And I knew I could take the commission, get promoted faster. But I was being well treated anyway. But I also knew I'd never want the Army in peacetime. And I thought the war was going to end sometime, and we were going to win it. And so I turned it down. I was seriously considered it because my colonel, the one that said, "God damn you, let's get a drink," also told me afterward I was higher headquarters had asked for me to come up to join them because I'd done an assignment for them, and they asked for me, but didn't command me. They just told me they'd like to have him, and they'd promote me to a major if I did. And he said, "I won't stop you if you want to go, but he said, if you'll stay with me, I'll promise to make you the next battalion commander," which is a lieutenant colonel's job. And it's, a command job. And the idea of commanding 800 troops when I would have been about 26. I was 25 when this conversation took place. And in a year or two, I'd have been commanding 800 troops and having that job. That is heady to a guy who was thinking that being a battalion commander at 26 in the engineers, that was a big, real appeal. So I turned the staff job down. And I also turned down the regular commission. But when the war was over, I didn't want to build airfields the rest of my life. I didn't want the Army in peacetime. So I didn't, that was the end of it.
Okay.
But I have a lot of admiration for people like Colin Powell, who really did, that was almost the prototype of what an Army career should be. And there were appeals to it, and I've never had trouble getting along in big organizations. I just find you can't go fast enough in them. So I told you why I didn't go with GE, and I had offers from GE and Westinghouse, DuPont, Linde Air, practically every big company you could think of, because they needed engineers at the time, and they needed engineers with a little experience, and GE done that. That's more than enough. I'm sorry.
That's
I
good.
get to telling these stories.
No. That's fine. That's actually, I wanted to talk about your military experience more from that aspect than about the engineering or the other things that you were technically, the technical work. So that was perfect.
Oh, I mean, building dry weather airfields with steel landing mats it's a frustrating process, and there are other stories. We, under these two colonels that I mentioned, with me as chief technical officer, that was my addition duty in addition to being headquarters and service company. The Germans had 9 airfields in eastern Italy. We turned out, by the time we got through the war, we went in there in the fall of '43. By the beginning of '45, we had 27 airfields operating. We were putting up 1,500 planes a day, raids, out of Italy. Not just out of those fields, but out of Italy. It was a huge project. I had 2 factories. I had 600 Italian civilians, which is another story that I won't take time to tell you because it probably would have gotten me court-martialed, but my Italians were going to strike on me when we were working around the clock and going mad and getting our pilots killed because of those raids. And saw John L. Lewis and his people out on strike back in the States, and they were going to strike on me, and I put an end to that, and with what might have gotten me court-martialed if I'd had to do it, but fortunately they didn't. The Italians, the final word was, we thought the Americans were the fools, but apparently they're not. Back to work.
That's funny. So the next phase is your early career, and it's interesting, the word startup appears pretty early on, it seems, in this phase of your career. And I'm just wondering, when you got out of the Army, what did you want to do? What did you think you could do? What did you choose to do?
Very straightforward. The company that I had worked at, I had 2 bosses. And before the war, this is Draveau Corporation in Pittsburgh. One of the 2 had left during the war and had run a porcelain enameling and stamping plant. Since he had been an MIT man, about 10 years older than I, and he was as close to a mentor as I had in that period. We'd gotten on very well, and I had very successful experience with Draveau, and under his and under another man's leadership. He had left to run a porcelain enameling and stamping plant. During the war, as you may recall, no civilian goods were made. So everything that was painted rusted out, and you couldn't buy new ones. The only things that stood up were porcelain enamel goods. And the world, he thought mistakenly, that the world was just going to very heavy usage of porcelain enamel. He wanted to start a company. He came from a wealthy family, and his father offered him money to start a company. Money we'd all spill today, but it was enough to start the company up. And this man put together a dream team he got the best technical man in the industry, the best manufacturing man in the industry, and a very good plant engineer, and then me as a very inexperienced person. I was by far the weakest of the people that he had, and I was put in charge of sales and application engineering. And he was just, I guess, on faith of what I could do. So we went into the business, and I'd never liked the porcelain enameling industry. That just did not appeal. You get, in that day at least, you get to be a little bit of a technical snob out of MIT. You really want to work on something that requires some engineering, and porcelain enameling was a pretty simple stuff. And it was into consumer products, which have never interested me very much. But starting up, working with this group and this high-grade team, and in what he thought was going to be a tremendously growing field. And I've always had an instinct for going after what would be growing type applications. So I joined him instead, and with a low salary and an uncapped commission. And we started up a porcelain enameling company. And at first it went moderately well, there were shortages of steel, and then he proved unable to raise as much money as he thought he was going to. We expanded more slowly. The technical man was very moody, and he got into a fight with the production man. The production man got fired. Then the technical man got into the fight with the boss, and he got fired. And then both were replaced by the boss with much weaker people. The boss didn't live up to expectations. He bought a small airplane, and we started to fly to where he wanted to fly to rather than where somebody could buy something. And I was I was on a starvation salary. I'd come back from the war. I was married, and I had had a child underway.
And where were you at this point?
This was Erie, Pennsylvania, which is where he started the company. And so everything, we started to have quality problems, and basically, really, I'd run a much bigger organization in the Army than he had. And he had what I would call a Cub Scout attitude toward everything. That is, if you wanted to build a fire, he'd rig up to, start a fire by friction and so forth. My attitude was, go get a match. He just didn't have that sort of practical attitude. And I remember once the lining of the furnace broke down, and we 4 executives went in and relined the furnaces with the 400-degree temperatures in the walls around us there. We did that kind of thing. I used to go out in the morning and make sales calls for a company that didn't exist, go back at noon, put on coveralls, and lay concrete block to help build it. We didn't build the whole thing, but we would pitch in and help the contractors, and it was all do-it-yourself. In the meantime, we were getting lousy production, and I went out on the production line often in the afternoon to help get shipments out. And I didn't mind the work as such. I'd done much tougher work, but I didn't mind the work. But it was just bad management, bad people, and but all that was tolerable until the company lost some business because of the quality, and we got into into financial troubles, and I persuaded another company to buy a press that could make something. I persuaded a customer to pay for the tools to make it. I got my father-in-law, who was in the steel business, to get us some steel, and we started turning out shower bases, which saved the company. And suddenly, money is pouring in. I have an uncapped commission, and I am quickly making more than the president of the company, and that wasn't tolerated. Well, I've always been very narrow-minded about anybody cutting my income. So I had an agreement with them, and they violated the agreement. So I said, I won't stay if that sort of thing, and no, we're going to reduce your commission. And I felt mistreated and left. Went to work for another company, didn't have any money. We did not have any family backup on either side, so I had to take a job in town. I was not equipped to move. So I went to work back into the power plant business and spent 3 years there doing application and service engineering in a very small but successful company where I did all kinds of interesting things, but I wasn't making a lot of money. And they had told me originally that I was sort of brought in as reporting to the general manager in an engineering application type job. And I was traveling all over the country. And in fact, in that period, I was sent out to the West Coast, and I gave a series of lectures. They gave me a fancy title of Associate Director of Research or something. And I went up and down the West Coast talking to technical societies all the way from the atomic energy plant up at Hanford, Vancouver, Portland, Seattle, several around San Francisco. I saw this place in 1949 on the Stanford campus on a beautiful Sunday in January. My wife and 2 children at that point are back deep in the snow in Erie. And I'm out here, it's lovely. I thought, what a lovely place to get a job. So I asked around about the job, and they said, well, we'd love to have you, but we can't afford you. If you want to pick grapes, fine, you get a job. If you want to raise vegetables, great. Or if you're already rich and you don't have to work, this is a lovely place to live, but your kind of job doesn't exist. 1949. Nobody mentioned Hewlett-Packard, and I think they were only a few $1 million in sales. It was 6 years before Bill Shockley had brought Shockley Semiconductor out here. So I wasn't badly paid, but a home phone call back east where both of our families were, a typical phone call was about 5% of my month's salary. So, and flying home for a family was just prohibitive. So I forgot about it. And I didn't really look into the West Coast again until the 60s, of course. Meantime, your semiconductor revolution had taken off. So I was then, somebody referred me to a small company in Des Moines, Iowa, which was starting up, was already in a business, doing about $500,000 a year and making about $20,000 a year profit. They brought me in as director of sales. They had an application for jet engines, and the jet engine business was just picking up, and I saw that as a dynamic growth area. And we had it was a fuel atomizing kind of business, and I went into that business at that time. And we built that company from 25 people. We built it to the largest fuel injection maker of jet engines nozzles in the world.
And that was Whitney.
Pardon?
Whitney?
No, J.H. Whitney is a venture firm. This was Delavan.
Delavan, okay.
Whitney had no connection with it.
Okay.
This was before Whitney.
All right.
But Pratt and Whitney was one of the customers, unrelated names.
And what did you learn about startups, young companies, at that point in all these experiences?
Oh, all the hazards, all the problems, all the first team failed because of fragmentation. The second company, after I'd been there a few months, I realized that when I got to the point of engineering and technology and looked at the competition, I found that our technology was really best suited to smaller boilers and smaller power plants, and we had no way of getting to the technology that was necessary to get the biggest jobs. And it had been a wonderful company for smaller applications. It was owned by 2 Germans that were they ran it quite well, but in a very conservative fashion. And I just never was going to make a lot of money there. And then it did a merger after I was there a year or so that pretty well blocked the future. And I learned to look at all the aspects of companies, and I particularly learned to look at the growth possibilities in the industry sector. I learned industry sectors are very different. And this is, I think, one of the minor things you observe about the younger venture capitalists out here. They have spent their entire careers in the information technology sector, which has been a wonderful horse to ride for 60 years or so. I mean, since the late 50s, when it really got going, primarily out here and to some degree in Boston, and the people like Texas Instruments in Dallas that took a license to Shockley's patents, those were tremendous economic drivers. I've learned this in other applications. I've learned to look at what are the economic drivers. A word that was just never used when I was in school, the concept was never thought of, was to look at where are you on, you're familiar with Clayton Christensen's work, where are you on the S-curve? Where is this? That thought was, I fortunately had that concept by the time I started my business of watching for the S-curve. But out here you've had a roaring, rising S-curve with a lot of little S-curves underneath it, some of them succeeding and failing. I mean, you went from core memories to semiconductor memories, to things of that sort. You went to integrated circuits, you went to all of those kinds of things. But, and opportunities have grown up under there, but the whole thing has been, the whole information technology sectors, you know better than most people, from your museum here, has just been one of the greatest economic opportunities the world's ever seen. There's been nothing like it in America, in my view, since the automobile. And again, what the automobile enabled, if you go back, I have a way of thinking, much of this has been developed in later years, but if you look back over history, one of the ways I think about things are that if you want to know what's going to happen, think to yourself, how would I advise a bright 18-year-old to start their career today? And look at what advice you would have given at various times in history. If you look back to 1700 and you have a bright 18-year-old and positions are pretty fixed, all the land is owned, all the forests are owned, all the game is owned, everything. And society has a very straight type activity. What do you tell the young person? Go to America. That's where the opportunity is. And later on, then you heard, go west. That's where the opportunity is. Skip over a lot of things and go to 1820. What do you tell a young person? Go in the canal business, because every little town along the canal is going to suddenly get a shot of business when the Erie Canal comes through. The Midwest is going to become a place that can ship wheat to New York, because the cost is going from $120 a ton before the Erie Canal to ship a ton of wheat to New York, prohibitive, to $6 a ton, where you can ship it down there, get it on ocean transport. 1840, railroads. You're an idiot not to join a railroad. 1860, and I may be careless with the numbers because I haven't researched them, but around that time, the telegraph. 1880, the telephone. 2000, you got to be an absolute idiot not to go in the automobile business. And what's wrong with the Rust Belt today, and they've heard so much nonsense about it, what's wrong with it is they had a glorious economic driver for 60 years, and they rode it for 100. I mean, in 40 years, about 45 years ago, I sold my General Motors stock. So my advisor had put some General Motors in my account, and I looked at him when he had discretion, and so it was there before I knew he was buying it. I called him up and said, what the hell is this stock doing in my account? Well, General Motors, heart of America. It's just un-American not to own General Motors. Pays a $5 dividend like a bond or something. Every American should own it. I said, garbage. They've got a 58% market share. The first company I was president of, I had a director who'd been assistant attorney general in charge of antitrust, and he gave me a lot of free lectures on antitrust. If they get any more, they're going to be in trouble with the Justice Department. I sell to them. I tell you how arrogant they are. I tell you they won't listen to advice on things we know more about than they do. Their unions or situations are terrible. They'll never. It's just everything is just going wrong. This is a peak for them. You're crazy. That's un-American. I get it out. Stock's never done better. I mean, they've been slowly. And where I was wrong was it took longer to go down. And where do we end up? General Motors broke.
Bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Let's, we've skipped way ahead. I want to come back a bit, if I can, back to Delvan, and after you've finished that. I know that was a very successful period for you, but what kept moving you? What were you looking for that you?
One of the things that I always lacked before venture capital was feeling that I was where the great opportunity was. We had that with a huge opportunity at Delavan because we found one of the things I always look for in a business is a comparative advantage. And Delavan made, it had, its basic technology was atomizing technique. And we had a few engineers, but they were quite good at that. And I was well trained in engineering, so it was easy to grasp the concepts. And it was clear that the jet engine business was going to be very large. And one of the things I dearly loved about it was that I thought of aircraft engines as nozzle eaters. If you sell an aircraft engine frame or structure, it lasts for thousands of hours. But a nozzle burns out in 1,000 hours or 2,000 hours at the most. So that they're just sitting there eating your product and needing replacements. They were very, very precise pieces. And at first we were making them with under magnifiers, using Des Moines farm women, polishing them with rouge powder and toothpicks. Well, I said, this is ridiculously archaic. Surely there's a way to automate this. Well, we had some quite good manufacturing people, some of whom had never been to college even, but they were quite good. And they kept hunting for ways to automate it. We sent them to Switzerland, and they bought Swiss automatic screw machines and watchmaking machines and all kinds of things. And they came back and said, Dave, there is no way to automate this. We're going to have to do it. We're going to have to continue to do this polishing under magnifiers. I said, we absolutely sure we've exhausted everything else? We're competing against a couple of machine tool companies, Excello in Detroit and Parker Hannifin in Cleveland, or Parker then, Appliance in Cleveland, and in Detroit, the diesel division of General Motors, these people. He said, absolutely. I said, are you certain these people can't find a way to automate that? Absolutely not. I said, well, then we have a competitive advantage and we are going to kill them. Why? Because we can do this job. We're all going to have to take a $500 capital installation, where I was expecting somebody would be using $100,000 of that day, which is close to $1 million of today, machine tool. I thought we'd have to have $1 million machine tool. We have a $500 installation and a little magnifier and a Des Moines farm woman polishing this under a magnifier. It was just a little like crocheting skills. I said, Detroit and Cleveland are going to have to compete against that with UAW workers? We will kill them. And oh, we did. They could not understand. They didn't figure out the differences. But we dominated 4 out of 5 of the Century series of engines. We became his preferred supplier. We were just limited by capacity. And the company was very successful, and I got on very well there. And once or twice I got some credit, because one thing that a Pratt & Whitney would do was shut you off, shut you down for a few months, if they delayed an engine or something. So you had to go out and get contract work, and I did that. And they were quite grateful. They told me I was going to be the next president of the company. And then Whitney came along, and Whitney had come along, J.H. Whitney, in 1950. He'd run across me through MIT's placement office and offered me a job with a company in 1950. I was very interested in them. I had a MIT contemporary who was a young partner at Whitney, and he tried to recruit me. I was interested in them, but not in the company, and I turned it down. And then they came back about every 2 years for the next 7 years. And I finally told them, I said, I don't think you guys think very much of me. He said, what do you mean we keep offering you jobs? I said, well, yes, but you offer me these dogs of companies. And they said, you know, we have had trouble with every company you turned down. Maybe you do know something. So they came along in 1957 and said, we have an international company that we think you won't turn down. And several things conspired at that point. I was sort of ready to be president. The company said I would be their next president, but they had a 45-year-old, 47-year-old guy that was perfectly satisfactory and a good guy. And I was 37, and I was very interested in the international business. This was very interested, and I had done about all that we could do there. I had stock in the company, and that's another story of, but I won't go into. But we didn't get options. I had borrowed money, and had persuaded the bank to give me more money than I expected them to give me. So my money was pretty tight around the house until I got a raise and some bonuses. But at any rate, so I left and took the job with J.H. Whitney, running originally the American licensee of the British company. It was a very small company at the time, but they were very internationally minded. It was founded by a couple of Jewish refugees from Germany, and they had the experience of being driven out of various countries, and you know, the wandering Jew way of thinking. And so they were very eager to get a little operation going in a lot of countries, so they had money in a lot of countries. They were, the boss had been driven out of, the founder had been driven out of Germany in 1933. And it'd taken many years to build up to still a very tiny company. And I was asked to run the American company, and ran that for 6 years. It did extremely well. And then they had originally promised us we could go public in America, but they came back and said a better idea is to merge with the parent in England and let us take a multinational public on the London Exchange, and get more involved with us. And so we thought about that, and it was the only obvious route to liquidity. They had 51%, so we couldn't go public, and it made a much more attractive offering the way we did. And it had another wonderful feature to it, which was that it was owned primarily by British financial institutions who reported in pound sterling, paid dividends in pound sterling. The company reported in pound sterling, paid dividends in pound sterling, but the company collected revenue in about 75 different currencies. So, and the British pound was a control currency, very overvalued at that point, and everybody knew it. But the British Treasury was holding the value at $5 to the pound, and this is way too high. And we knew devaluation was coming. But our company, if you were a British if you were a British financial institution and you had huge amount of money, but if you wanted to convert it from pounds to dollars, you had to get Treasury permission, and B, you had to pay a huge premium for doing it. But if you bought our stock, it was an automatic hedge. So that, and the fact the British were pretty good managers, unlike many, they were good. And so we were very successful, and the stock was a very successful offering. And Whitney said at the time that we were their best cash-on-cash return they'd ever had at that time. Partly because, in my opinion, they were very chary with using any cash. They used almost nothing, so I could have nearly an infinite return on. Whitney was marvelous at selling their reputation and mystique.
And this was your first time to be a president, so how did you like it? Was it everything you'd hoped it would be?
Loved it. And I was worked out very well as a president. I was never ecstatic about metallurgical chemicals. It was, as one of my directors described, it was kind of a grubby business. And Gary worked there at the plant one summer, and he found it. But my wife was quite insistent in particular that my sons get an experience, and the first two did, working in the plant. But I love the international aspect, and we had 57 corporations. We manufactured in 22 countries. We warehoused and sold in about 75 countries. We were a very sophisticated operation. We had Swiss-based licensing companies and Swiss-based holding companies. We were sophisticated enough to know which canton in Switzerland was better for what kind of company. I mean, we were into that depth of international. We knew not only to put it in Switzerland, we knew where to put it in Switzerland. For we have better laws and effectively in one county than in another. When the merger came, the British, instead of replacing me, asked me to become chairman for North America and run all the companies they had over here, which included the Mexican company, the Canadian company, another company I had bought for them, and I bought a company very advantageously for them. And I went down and I found I became chairman of America and chairman for Canada. Went down there and found that we had sent an Englishman to Mexico, and the Englishman went down there and was told you had to bribe to do business in Mexico. So I think everybody who put their hand out to shake hands with him, he put money in it. So I had to clean up a bribery situation in Mexico, which I did with the Mexican president. And we straightened it out and got it an honest operation, and it made it all very successful. And I ran North America, went on the parent board and started the shuttle to London that American companies that are controlled do. And well, we had gone from a little low-grade company in Birmingham, headquartered, to where we bought and were our London headquarters was practically in the palace grounds. It was 36 Queen Anne's Gate, one of the streets leading up to the palace. It was the old Esso European headquarters as such. Gorgeous gardens, Henry Moore statue in the garden. We were living and they lived the high life. There's no doubt about it. And that was just fine. But then I ran that for 5 years or so, and partly I was getting tired of it. Partly I was, I'd done the same thing. Partly I saw changes coming in the steel industry that threatened some of our best products. I mean, the steel technology was changing.
This was in the late 60s.
This was reached a head in about 67. Whitney sold out in 67 with this very high return of a very small amount of cash. I thought they were going too soon and told them so. And I stayed another year, the stock doubled again. I didn't sell at the top, but I sold when I left. And I'd become chairman I'd become a director of an electronics company on the side from friends. I'd been very active in the Young Presidents Organization, and I did every top job in that except president, and they asked me about it, and my board would not have let me take that job on, and they were right. But I will say later, after I started my own business, I was invited into the honorary organization of the Young Presidents, which is called the Chief Executives, which takes about 1 out of 5 YPO graduates. And I was subsequently asked to be and became president of it. So but I had been senior vice president international for YPO. I'd been national membership chairman, and I'd been national secretary, I think, and all those kind of jobs. I'd been chapter chairman. I did some integrating of the organization. But having said that, what happened was Whitney sold out, very happy. And I stayed on and watched my stock double again, and it was very high. And I wanted to grow by acquisition. The British in '67 had agreed to that, but because I felt that technological changes were menacing some of our products, and the high growth rate we'd been on had to slow down. I felt we weren't going to hell or anything of that kind, but the S curve was topping out, and they didn't have new products coming. The future of some products worried me. The nature of some others worried me, and I just was ready to do acquisitions to grow by something else. The British originally agreed to do that, and I was actually looking for offices and to set up a separate operation and spend my time acquiring and hire another president in to run the American company. And then the conglomeration boom of the mid-'60s collapsed, and particularly Litton Industries went to hell. You may remember.
I remember.
And they were very sensitive to that around Cleveland because they came into town and bought Stouffer, Vernon Stouffer's company, with their stock at about 125, and bought Vernon out completely, and Litton, and soon thereafter, quite soon, almost months thereafter, stock was down around 10. I talked with one of his in-laws the other day, and just recently, and he said some of that stock went into Vernon's estate at $3 a share. Just tragic, and he'd sold out at 125. Well, the investment bankers told the British that the conglomerateering boom, and this was the Chinese money era, when the big companies were buying because their stock was trading at 15, they'd find a private company who, if the owner wanted to sell a private company, he couldn't get more than 7 or 8 times earnings, and his buyers were limited. So they could go in and offer him 10 times his earnings in their stock, add his earnings to theirs, and through accretion, they'd immediately mark them up. So they'd get a jump in earnings every time to fit up with their growth. And that went on, and the stock got to be known as Chinese money, back when Chinese money wasn't as good as it is now. And so the British had never liked my idea. They were mostly doing it to keep me, but they finally said they wouldn't do it. And I said, well, I had said before I had no further interest in the group if they wouldn't let me do that. So that's when I sold out.
I see. And were you aware as you were doing that this whole industry called venture investing was beginning to get started? Was this in your mind that you wanted to take your money and begin with that?
I was intimately familiar with venture investing because I'd been close to Whitney since 1950, and this was 1968, and I had run a company for Whitney, and with them on my board, and when they sold out, even they didn't get off the board. From 57 to 68. So I knew the Whitney situation. I mean, I played bridge with Jock Whitney, that kind of on occasion, and I'm intimately close to their people and heard a lot of the inside characteristics of venture capital. And this, of course, was 57 to 59. When I went to FASICO was just about the time your angel investing was starting out here. There's an article I have out of something like Time or Fortune maybe or something, talking about the group or the bunch, whatever they call them. And it was Reed Dennis and John Bryant and Bill, what's his name?
Bill Draper.
Well, Bill came a little later, I think. These people were doing something else, but they were meeting for lunch. And Reed tells the story.
In downtown San Francisco.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Reed was with the Fireman's Fund and at the time, but Reed he told me he had something like $20,000 left over from his college fund that his grandmother had given him, and he stuck that into Ampex and made some money, and got off as an angel investor on the side. And these guys would meet for lunch and hear a pitch from an entrepreneur and go out on the sidewalk afterward and decide among them if they were interested and if they'd piece up the investment. And that got started out here in the late 50s. Whitney had been going since 45. Jock came home and started it. And American Research started in Boston within months of that. Unclear, the whole thing happened. Both were doing it within 3 or 4 months of each other. Whitney was late 45, I know.
So this was well established at that point, and I'm thinking more about you personally, or the fact that an individual, which is how all funds start, but I'm just thinking about you as an individual deciding at that point that you were going to begin venture investing as the next phase.
Well, let me explain a little of my thinking on that. I had always had the feeling that I was interested in the bigger picture, and every industry sector that you get into confines you to that sector, and you develop more or less expertise. You develop more and more expertise. You know more and more about less and less in a way. I had felt that the industry sectors, nobody used the words like that, but I had picked the power plant sector primarily because I happened to be very good in thermodynamics, and in college in particular. And I had a better than average professor who had a good deal of practical industrial experience. And my machine design professors were rather less attractive people. And machine design in those days had a lot of drudgery in it because we didn't have computers, we didn't have electronic calculators, and so were doing a lot of things that were cumbersome and time consuming. And it just never thrilled me quite as much. And I liked the math of thermodynamics and the concept. And for some reason, mechanical engineers seem to kind of divide into two categories. Those that concepts like entropy and enthalpy and things of that sort appeal to, and those that don't like that, but they like a practical machine design, and they'd rather design gear trains than they would evaporating boilers and things like that. Well, I was on the enthalpy. I liked the math, I liked the enthalpy and entropy, and I got on very well with it. So I was interested in thermodynamics, but in those days that was, and still is, I mean, that really was a mature industry, comparatively speaking, in that the way we made turbines, well, I haven't been involved in turbines for a long time, but they aren't that different today. And the calculations I did in graduate school on turbine blade design, probably they'd be done by machine today, by CAD machines, but probably they're done just about the same way. Well, information technology didn't exist. And so that was a relatively mature industry. And boilers, they've been, but it's been sustaining research in boilers for 50 years probably or more. And so I was always concerned that I wanted to be at the edge of the new. I didn't want to be so new that you had too high a risk of failure. I share the discovery that's been made about entrepreneurs, which is that the best entrepreneurs really are moderate risk takers. They're not shoot the moon. You occasionally get a guy that will shoot the moon, but generally speaking, the good ones calculate their risk pretty carefully, and I want a very good risk-reward ratio. If I take a big risk, I want a really big payoff if I win. And so and I had never really liked, I certainly didn't want to stay in the, I didn't want to, I found, going back to it, I really didn't want to stay in the power plant field or power generation field. I had briefly thought after the atomic bomb was dropped that in 1945, I thought, God, that obsoletes everything I know about power generation, because even my wristwatch, if you read the Dick Tracy comics, even that's going to be powered atomically. I maybe need to go back to school and learn about this, and fortunately I didn't, because atomic energy has been a waste of most people's career. And God knows there's no future in building dry weather fields in Africa and Italy. And civil engineering never appealed to me very much. If I'd been smarter, I probably would have gone into that and built shopping centers. One of my friends in Cleveland was one of the owners of the Cleveland Indians. And they built shopping centers and built hundreds of millions of dollars of a fortune. Well, I easily knew enough coming out of the Army to build shopping centers, but it didn't appeal at all. And again, as I said earlier, you wanted a technically appealing thing, and I just didn't find information technology. I didn't have any training in the electrical end of it, and of course, all of our training had been with electricity of electric motors and power generators, electric generators, moderate amount of electrical transmission, and vacuum tubes. And semiconductor had not existed. Transistor didn't exist when I was in school. So I wanted, and I'd always felt what I really wanted to do was set up shop at, my metaphor was set up shop at the crossroads of the world, where all these opportunities pass you by. Because I felt when you're in the porcelain enameling business and there's so many things you can't do, you know, boo, this is a confining place. And the power plant place, you weren't going to go out and start another boiler company. There was no obvious technology, disruptive technology you could bring into it. The jet engine business we had milked thoroughly. I would not have remotely. Delavan would have been hopeless competition to start a company against. And today, 50 years later, the same people are still leading in the industry. And metallurgical chemicals, I think the British feared when I left I might compete with them. I wouldn't dream of it. I thought that field was very over the hill. And but venture capital offered me the opportunity, and then that it really was setting up your shop by this side of the world, and where countless opportunities pass you by, and that emotionally appeals to me constantly and immensely. And I have, just the other day, one of my investment advisors said that one of the reasons that he liked to work with me was that that I have such a curiosity about new things. That I was, at my age, I should be 92% in bonds, and I don't own a bond. I was driving him into a more elaborate, sophisticated investment technique than he was used to using, and he's 30 years younger than I am. But I said, all right, let's put a small amount of money in there and experiment in that area. So this gave me an opportunity to indulge my curiosity, to look at new things. And now, right now, in the venture industry, in my opinion, again, and I'm not hearing anybody else say this, but in my opinion, one of the problems we have is that the new thing hasn't appeared. We are well up the curve of what is done with information technology. And I'll get a good deal of argument from people like our IT team and Gary and others, because they feel that there's huge opportunity left. We're not down, Moore's law hasn't hit its asymptote. And we are, but now to some degree, you can make a point that all these social media, advertising and so on, is a certain amount of froth on the surface of things. But let's put it out, this is a world that will buy a certain amount of froth. The hula hoop doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense, but they sold a lot of them. Facebook and a lot of this exchanging of information with people don't make a lot of sense, but it sells. And I've learned long since, don't use myself as a market test. I'm a very poor judge, because the fact that I want it or don't want it doesn't mean that many others are going to want it. So the important question as a marketer, and I've been one most of my career, is do they want it? Go out there and find out, are they going to buy it? And it's been somewhat unbelievable to our generation that people will spend time emailing all their friends in one form of saying, I feel like sushi for dinner, what do you feel like? Well, with all courtesy, I like you very much, but I don't give a damn what you want for dinner. Unless I'm going to order it for you. I don't care. I don't want you to tell me you want sushi for dinner. I don't want to waste my time reading that email. But so you wonder how far we are up on that curve. And another thought I've always had about venture capital is a way of looking at it. You have technologies that are looking for a market. You have markets that are looking for a technology. What, for instance? What can you do with a cure for cancer? If you had a cure for cancer, you've got a staggering market. If you've got a cure of a whole series of other, those are markets waiting for a technology. Today, you take nanotech. What have you got? You've got a technology. We know a number of ways to make very small particles. We just don't know anybody that wants to buy a lot of them at this point, to buy tons of them. And we've seen a good deal of money wasted. We wasted a bit ourselves in trying to take a reasonable technology, and we're hunting desperately for somebody who wants a lot of it. We have an interesting new idea at this point that may make us successful on our ability to make small particles and blend. We'll see. It relates to fuel.
Can you talk now a little bit about how you made that transition from the first investments you made, not being involved in information technology much, to the follow-on investments you made, to establishing an office out here, and then really getting involved in technology? Can you just talk about that migration?
Yes. As I said, when I basically, in a way, I left Fasico, as I indicated, because they wouldn't let me do what I thought was indicated and what I wanted to do. And had they let me do so, I might have finished my career there, because I would have gone in and bought companies for them. Now, this is a part of what we do today. We have part of our activity is what you would call private equity rather than early stage venture capital. We buy companies, and we didn't start there, and that. And one of the things I considered when I left Fasico, and I had the first substantial amount of liquid capital that I'd had, and I started my business, as I think you're aware, with my own capital entirely. I used no outside capital. I didn't raise any money. I borrowed money at times, but never. It was never 90% or anything of that kind. And I didn't raise money. I wasn't used to raising money from institutions, and frankly, at 48, I was sort of tired of having a boss. And my British stockholders had been bosses at the board level. I never had any difficulty getting onto the board. I'm not a guy that has a problem when dealing with authority, but when you have many, when you're disagreeing with policy on people and you think you're right, you get an urge to run your own show. And 48, if I was going to, so I was looking around, and while I was looking and deciding, I'd made two or three angel type investments already when I started. And one of the regional investment banks heard that I was starting out, and they had a kind of experience with inviting executives and residents. And so they immediately contacted me and asked if I'd like to come in and live inside the bank, the investment bank, for a while. And I did that and started my business out of the investment bank. They weren't primarily seeking me as a partner. They were looking at me as a guy who would start or buy companies and let them co-invest. And I went in on that basis. I didn't become a partner in their firm. I didn't want to. And those were partnerships where you opened up your net worth, and they were a regional bank and not nothing that exciting. But it was a convenient place, and it was quite an education for me because most people have not lived inside an investment bank. And one of the trader's offices was right outside my office. And so I often would go and lean over his shoulder as he traded. Once in a while I'd have him trade my stock and watch that. And I had myself an education program that every day, if I didn't have a business date, I'd invite one of their people to lunch. I bought a lot of lunches. I took traders to lunch. I took syndicate managers to lunch. I took account executives to lunch. If things were desperate, I'd even take a broker to lunch and talked about the investment banking from the inside. And I had a lot of fun with, later I became a limited partner in Hambrick and Quist. And when I was on a couple of boards with Bill Hambrick, and Bill and I formed a close affiliation, and they offered me a general partnership or a limited partnership or anything I wanted to join their firm. But they were only expecting a limited partnership. And I, because I didn't, in those days they were you'd open your net worth up, and they looked riskier than I did. But at any rate, Bill, but occasionally I'd be representing a company in a negotiation usually, and we were all on the board, Bill and Tommy Erneberg, and they'd give me some of this investment banker standard line, and I would come through with a piercing remark in regard to it. Bill would say, "How do you know that?" I forgot. "Oh, you live with an investment bank. I forgot that." And you learn how different a transactional mentality is. And I was living there as we evolved from the relationship investment banking as toward the transactional investment banking that's being done today. I'm just coincidentally currently reading a book about Goldman Sachs, and John Weinberg, whom I got to know socially extensively in the later part of his life and my career. He just died several years ago, but I know he and his wife take the cottage next to us at the Lyford Key Club, so we socialized a good deal when we were down there and saw each other in New York occasionally. Weinberg was sort of the last of the old, honest-to-God, high ethical, relational investment bankers. And I got a good deal of that early tradition and watched it evolve into transactional. So I have had the advantage of a little better understanding of investment banks than many people in the business have who've never been in one, because to an operating guy, it's a different world.
And what were the first investments you made? What were the first important investments when you first started up?
One of the first, I made as I told Gary the other day, I tend to forget the investments I lose money on. I forget their names, but I don't stay up nights brooding about them. The first really significant one I made that really worked out very nicely was a company called Manufacturing Data Systems in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which was essentially a time-shared computer application for manufacturing operations. It was the programming of numerically controlled machine tools. There was a niche in time where machine tool makers made the controls for their machines and provided a programming language, and they would program their machines, but not others. And then they got into computer assistance of this, and a couple of the time-sharing companies provided the assistance. And people in Ann Arbor, spinning out of the University of Michigan, a time-sharing company spun out of that. And it in turn was quite creative at throwing off a half dozen companies. And one of the ideas, the business concepts that it turned out, was this computer programming for numerically controlled machine tools. And I knew a good deal about machine shops from my Delavan and Northern Equipment days in particular, and was intimately familiar with how you ran them and how they thought. And I found, as I looked at this, that General Electric was offering a big program to program numerically controlled machine tools, but it was designed by mathematicians. It was cumbersome and elaborate. You could do far more things than the average machine shop wanted or needed, but it was troublesome. And the machine tool makers would program their own machines, but not others, which was a terrible mistake. These people in Ann Arbor had come up with quite a simplified version that with modifications would apply to a lot of machines. And they were going out to sell this service. And the company had a concept that troubled me, which was they thought they'd go out and sell to machine shops and get the shop to pay for the programming necessary to tailor it for them. I'd been in a machine shop and I didn't think in smaller shops that would sell, and it didn't. But so that I invested in this, and in the beginning, and we got one or two other individual investors to invest in it, but I was the largest stockholder. And in those happy days, I had only a small 10% partner. I didn't have any limited partners. I did it with my money. And we had the concept failed, and then we had to raise some more money. The management listened to their lawyer a bit too much, and I offered them a proposition. They thought they could do better. They went out and looked and found they couldn't and were giving up or going out of business. So I went out and raised them some more money from several of my sources. And we built them up, and we got it, it was down to the last $50,000 when it turned cash flow positive. And it went on. It was quite successful by 74 and 75. I'd invested in 69. And in August of 75, I decided it was time we could take it public. And I called Bill Hambricht, and Bill said, in essence, that was, at the tail end of the recession in 75. You're out of your mind. I said, well, come on in and have a look. So Bill met me at the airport in Detroit, and I remember sitting in the garden of the motel with him talking the night before. And he was just doing me a favor to be there, no faith. I took him in the next day, and the company made its pitch to him. And he sat there for 3 or 4 hours, and I watched his face cry. And he said, by God, we can take this public too. So he got Tommy Unterberg, with Unterberg Tobin, the two of them in there. And we took the company public in February of 76. And it was really the first significant offering of the turnaround after we came out of the recession. And the company, we had figured out a niche, a way in between what the other people were doing. And I had figured out that if they let us alone long enough to get our specialized software written and paid for, then we were going to be almost, they could almost do nothing to get us out, because we changed our business model from making them pay for the software to where we would pay for it, and we let them sign up for very short-term leases. They could month to month, but we were habit forming. Once they got us in, it was just too easy to keep paying us, and it was so hard to throw us out and get somebody else to program it. And we had all kinds of things. McKinsey came in and wanted to do a study, and they sent one of their bright young men in, and they said, oh, you're using a second generation computer. You should use a third generation computer. Well, we were using second generation computers, true, but on the particular function they were doing, they were about as good as third generation were. And the two time-sharing companies had a lot of these 928 computers that I recall, SDS computers, that were perfect for this application, miserable for a number of others. And the only thing wrong with them was they could only handle about a dozen people at a time, but there were a lot of them. And so they provided the communications network. We bought computer time at $6.50 an hour, and we found that the guys weren't very sensitive to the hourly charge. We sold it for $65 an hour. So with this huge markup, the company became very successful. And our program was, we made sure we trained a lot of people in the industry, and the industry got to where our program was called Compact 2. And you just find an ad, wanted Compact 2 programmer. These people were, and we just dominated the field completely. And we eventually were operating in 12 countries, as I think we had time sharing all over the world. Very successful. Then we got too successful for the big companies, and they demanded that we sell them machines and software so they could do it for themselves. And we saw controls coming where this could be on the machines, as it's done more today. That worried me, and also I found that we had kind of outgrown our management. They had gotten a bit, they were running brilliantly on their own, but I told the president that he was like a foreign car with 6 gear speeds in it. But his problem was the 4 in the middle were missing. He had the strongest low gear I ever saw because he could do anything. But if he wasn't doing it himself, he went all the way over to overdrive. There was just nothing where you controlled a program and stayed on top of it, but didn't have to carry it out yourself. And he was getting to the point where he was taking a month for his managers to get in to see him, which is ridiculous in any company, but particularly in a smaller company. The stock did very well. It was trading up, and our partners in the investment banking firm had co-invested with us and paid, not partners, but the people that I was living with. They had co-invested and paid me a fee. They let me use their fund like a fund. So I had a co-investor and we got paid for it. They were eager, screaming to sell because the highest price they'd paid was $1.11 a share. The stock was trading, went public at 6. The stock was trading then at 30. They were screaming to sell. A lot of them were investment bankers and brokers, and that kind of profit they just never seen. I wouldn't let them sell. Held them out, and I hunted around, heard through Whitney that Schlumberger, one of the Whitney partners was on the Schlumberger board. Schlumberger was interested in the field. Jean Rabou, the then chairman, wanted to diversify into electronics. Not his greatest idea, but he wanted to do that. And he'd gotten interested in one of the Whitney companies, but he didn't like the president. And the Whitney company and our company fitted, and so I got together with the Whitney people. And we made a deal to merge the companies, but then we couldn't get the presidents to accept it. Ours was much senior and wanted to run it for a while, and the Whitney president wouldn't accept that, so that deal fell apart. Well, I walked out of the Whitney office and walked over to Lazard and said, "You have Felix Rawdon on the board of Schlumberger. Can you represent us?" And we got Hamrick and Quist to introduce us to Lazard. "Can you represent us and sell this to Lazard?" Well, an investment banker will find any way in the world that brings a commission that he'll resolve the conflict. So, to my non-surprise, Felix said absolutely. So he went, and so Lazard and Hamrick and Quist, but mostly Lazard, sold the company to Schlumberger. We got paid in Schlumberger stock at about $64 a share. My original cost on the stock had been 22 cents. And it was liquid in 30 days, and Schlumberger stock went up after we had. So we sold out to Schlumberger. And then Schlumberger, our president, persuaded them to go back and buy the other company. And then Rabu had fallen in love with him. Our president was a nut on planes, but he didn't understand the French, and unfortunately, Rabu had him picked for a big job, and he didn't have the patience to wait for it, so he went off on his own. That was, 22 cents and the highest I ever paid for any of his stock was about $1, and selling it at 64 into Schlumberger stock. I still have a fair amount of the stock.
So with that anecdote right there about that investment, can I ask you a couple of questions about your philosophy? I saw a piece of film recently where a series of venture investors were lined up. They were interviews just like this. And the one question they were asked was, is it the person or is it the idea? And they went down the line and answered. All these clips were cut together. And the string of clips was, oh, the person, no, it's the idea, no, it's the person, no, it's the idea. And it was clear that from all of these investors, there was no consensus on whether the best thing to invest in is the person or the idea. Do you have a philosophy about that?
Absolutely. This is something I've thought through very carefully. And because I found when I started the business in Cleveland and was talking to people about it, and they would come and pitch something to me, and I'd turn it down. They'd say, "Oh, you only invest in star performers like Bob Noyce or somebody of that sort." Or others would say, "Oh, you only invest in a huge market," or "You only invest in a really state-of-the-art patented technology." And I said, wrong, absolutely wrong. I want all three. The venture investing is like a stool, a three-legged stool. And take a look at the metaphor I use regularly, and I've taught this extensively around the Midwest. Let's say you have a superb technology. Let's say it addresses a big market. Let's say you have a lousy management. You've got a strong leg for the technology. You've got a strong leg for the market. You've got a weak leg for the market. What does a three-legged stool with a weak leg do? It collapses and puts some load on it. Let's say you've got a wonderful management, but you've got a lousy technology and they can't find another one. You're into really what my second company at Northern Equipment was. It had a technology suited only for certain applications, and there just was no way to get that technology from here to there. Or let's say today you're with one of our recently failed companies. You've got this wonderful nanotech technology. We can do all these kinds of things. We just can't get anybody to buy it. If you don't have the three, or use the other horse race metaphor that I like, which is the concept is the horse. the technology is usually, I mean, a McDonald's is a non-technical concept, or any commercial good. The Gap was a non-technology concept. You have a concept there, a good one or a bad one, but you're riding that concept, and if you can't get out of it or find another one, you're a prisoner of it. Let's say you address a small market. That is running your horse at the county fair. And let's say you have a good jockey. If you have a wonderful jockey and a wonderful horse and you run him at the county fair, small market, you win easily. But the prize is $50. That's a small market problem. Let's say you're running in the Kentucky Derby and you've got a moderately good horse. You haven't the chance, which is you've got a mediocre technology. You haven't a chance in hell. Or let's say you've got a wonderful technology and you're in a big, big market, but you've got a weak entrepreneur. He falls off the horse. And I did an analysis in many years ago in our information technology companies of our disappointments, of the ones that had not performed too well. And I found, to my amazement, only about 10% of our disappointments came from the technology not doing what we thought it would do. This is in the IT sector. I was surprised we were that good, but I didn't really expect it. But we get a lot of consulting help on this. We talk to people that really know. And if you have a good technology and a competent team, they'll usually execute. 10% of the failures. About 30% of the time, something will happen to the market that you didn't or couldn't anticipate. A competitor, you're going to do a subscription model company, and the competitor comes out, gives it away for free and sells it on advertising. That blows up your concept, and maybe you can't be economical. The market changed on you. Something else happens. What happened with Fasico, my metallurgical company, the steel mill changed. Nothing went wrong with our product. They just didn't need it anymore because they changed the way they were making steel. So something happens to the market that wasn't your fault and you couldn't see, or just plain otherwise. But when that was about 30% in the IT area. But the rest of it was the entrepreneur just fell off the horse. The jockey just fell off the horse. The technology worked as expected. The market was as expected. The guys just didn't execute. Either various mistakes that might make it. They spend too much. They expand too soon. They build a sales force before it's ready. They fail to follow the industry trends. Something that was a better management, you tell yourself, would have avoided that mistake. And that was about 60% of our failures.
So let me ask you the second question, because it follows right on to what you just said. In taking a lot of these oral histories of venture investors, my observation has been that the first generation investors, let's say 50s, 60s, 70s, and the second generation, 80s, maybe right up to the early 90s, just before the internet explosion, were hands-on investors. They simply didn't just put their money in. They got in there with the companies and really helped build those companies and were more hands-on. Today you find all sorts of approaches. It seems to me there are fewer hands-on investors than there were when you were first starting out and building Morgenthaler. Was that your approach? Were you really hands-on with the entrepreneurs, the companies, the boards, and really helping to think through their business models and make changes, and even change the entrepreneur if you fell off the horse?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, that was absolutely paramount. That was a big part of the value add. And we didn't hesitate to take a strong point of view and to replace the management and to face down the management. My star company that I was telling you about in the beginning there, one day the management was trying to promote, we were quite successful by that time, and the management was trying to promote really pretty outrageous increases in salaries. And I said, well, we'll bring in I was a consultant. I was the chairman and the largest stockholder. I said, we'll bring in a consultant. And we brought in Towers Perrin, and they brought in a sensible set of recommendations, more or less industry standard. And the president didn't like that. He was full of how successful they were, and said he, without my permission as chairman, he went and got another consultant. And I would have expected to be consulted on bringing somebody of that kind of policy thing, something I knew a good deal more about than he did. And we brought another consultant in, and a tame one being paid for it. And this guy came in with an outrageous recommendation of what we should pay, which is what the president wanted to hear. And I said, absolutely not. I said, I'm already getting complaints from the investment bankers and the analysts on our stock. We were public. The analysts are coming in here and looking around the parking lot, and this is Michigan, and they're seeing a good many Mercedes and Porsches and companies of that kind, and they're already commenting about the way our managers are spending here. And this guy said, you mean you'd pay attention to what the analysts say on a thing like that, on your compensation? I said, you're damn right I would. I'm concerned about what the stock sells for. I'm vitally concerned about the analysts, and we're not going to pay this ridiculous price. So the president came back to me and said, well, if you won't pay this, you just may not have a management team. And I said, well, Bill, and his name wasn't Bill, I said, well, Bill, I've found, and as companies grow, there comes a time you outgrow a management team. And maybe this incident is illustrating to us that we have just outgrown the management team we've got. And that's the last I ever heard of the subject. We accepted the Towers Perrin and the end of it. The chief financial officer told me later, can he do that? The CFO says, he's got the votes. He can do it, and I would do it, and I'd have fired him. Because I mean, it was more than just this. He was getting to be the village squire. He wanted to be on this board, that board, the other board, and he'd go out to. He wanted to spread himself very thin. He had to have a company plane, and I used an incident there that I've always. Management technique is always kind of amusing, but it worked. And the point about the company plane was it was flying all too often to Bermuda and the Bahamas, and you're surprised how few machine shops there are in Bermuda and Bahamas and so on. So it was too much of the good thing, but he was a plain nut. I mean, a plane plain nut. Just couldn't stop it. And so finally, and he made the point, and it was a good marketing point, that we were selling to hundreds of little machine shops around the Midwest. And it was very easy to send the plane out in the morning, pick up the machine shop owner, fly him into Ann Arbor for the day, give him demonstration of everything we could do and show him around there and the plane ride, and then give him an elaborate dinner and then fly him home that night, and he'd only lose a day of business. And the smaller shop owner, it was kind of a thrill to be flown in and out. So that was a good deal when we were doing that and so on. But but the president still, an awful lot of this was personal flying, and so when we just couldn't stop him. I refused it early in the game when he wanted one, and then I found that he joined some flying club, and his plane had landed on an ice floe in Lake Michigan at this point. God, he's taking this kind of thing. So finally, we made him get a pilot, though he was a pilot too. So the two of them were flying the plane, and so when we finally agreed on it, that he wanted to buy a jet. So I brought him in with the CFO, and I said, fellas, I wanted to explain to you how things are. Here's the door. Next to it is sitting the jet. If anything, next to it is sitting the chief financial officer, and next to it is the president. If anything at all happens, you miss a forecast, anything bad goes wrong, the jet is out the door. You, the chief financial officer, if you haven't warned me of the trouble, it probably is his fault, but I'll need him to straighten it out. But you're gone. I can replace you with from somebody from the accounting firm tomorrow to keep the books at least until we can hire a new controller. So if you let me be unwarned about some problem, you're fired. I should fire him, but I need him. You're gone. I said, but the jet goes first. So I took them later. It was a young CFO, and he was very shocked at my seeming brutality. I took him aside later and said, John, I have just strengthened your hand immensely, because what I've done here is, one day, this is a strong president. One day, he is going to want you to do something you shouldn't do. You're going to miss a quarter by a couple of things, and he's going to want you to pull down some reserves, and thinks that I won't pick it up in accounting. Or he's going to want you to bend a rule somewhere along here. And you're going to say, gee, Ken, you're my boss. I did use his name there. You're my boss. I would do what you tell him and so forth, but that bastard Morgenthaler will find out about it, and he'll fire me. And you won't be able to stop it because you'll be too busy protecting your own job. And I said, your job is to walk around with everything he wants to do, because he's full of ideas, and say, do you realize this is X cents per share off that? Do you realize how this is going to hit that budget? Do you realize what this is going to do to our sales in such and such an area? Do you realize how much capital investment do you realize is the first thing? When you pull him back to results, then he gets pretty sensible. So that was our technique. That company ran like a charm. And they never lost his plane.
I'd call that very hands-on.
Well, that was my style always.
Why and when expand to California?
Well, first of all, we went where the opportunities were. Now, my original partnership, I had just one young associate who was 27 when I hired him. I'd hired him out of business school for the company I was operating, and I made him a small partner very quickly, because I wanted him to work on everything, including some of my personal investments, because I had personal investments in various things, and I wanted to put that in the partnership, the original partnership, Morgenthaler Associates, which had all these other things in it. And we had no outside money in Morgenthaler Associates ever. We had this co-investing with this other group, but they had a standalone set of investments, which we got a carry on and a special deal with them. But money was not mixed. And so, what's my point? What was your question again? I'm sorry.
Why and when move to California? You were talking about you had.
Well, because at that time we were going everywhere, but it became clear, more and more clear, especially in the '80s, that California was going to be the big winner, and we were. I'd say one of my strategic misjudgments was that I thought there would be bigger opportunities in robotics and in application of computers to manufacturing in the Midwest than there proved to be, and we had a couple of unsuccessful investments in that area. It became increasingly clear that the activity was here. It became increasingly clear that Boston was losing first place to Silicon Valley, and I waited until I wanted somebody strong in IT, and that was I didn't want to just put a body out here, and I didn't have anybody in Cleveland strong enough in information technology. And so we waited actually until Gary's company was sold and he became available. And he had, of course, a very, very strong IT background at that point, and he'd had a success in several smaller successes and a big success at Ingress. And so when he became available, we opened up an office out here. But I wanted to start with a strong IT person, because particularly, and that was, you came out here, Gary, about '89 or so, didn't it? I waited too long, partly waiting for the right person. Partly, again, we'd been so successful on our own. Because we managed a lot of money, we've made obviously a lot more money since then. But cash on cash, which is when you've used your own cash, you're very conscious, I'm putting X dollars out there, and I'm not looking for 2 or 3X, I'm looking for 5 or 10X or more. And I never forgot my 22 cents to $64 arithmetic in there, and I've tried very hard to do it again ever since. But the only way I find to do that is get that 22 cents down to nothing. I can get a better model. But so
what are the investments here and in Silicon Valley and in ventures here that really stand out for you?
Well, we get more credit for the fact we put money in Apple Computer than anything else. Nothing particularly remarkable beyond that.
Talk about the Apple investment. Could you just talk about that a bit?
Oh yes, that was another one of my partial mistakes. When I came into this business, it was very clear in '68 it was really too late to do anything in the mainframe business. And we invested in a couple of supercomputer companies along the way, but nothing ever. The last big winner there was Control Data, and we invested in a couple of others, Masscomp and 1 or 2 there that I've almost forgotten. Remember, we've even done over 350 investments at this point, and increasingly others were doing these, and I tell you the first few intimately because I did them all. The others, people did them, and I didn't have as much to do with them. But the sequence was that we were too late for mainframes, clearly, and we were late in '68 and '9. We were late for mini computers because DEC was already pretty strong by then. Data General had spun out of DEC and was doing well, and there were a couple of others. Prime came along behind us, but it was clear to me we found a particular application in Florida, modular computer systems, that was the one we were talking about earlier today, that was a powerful opportunity. And we went into it, and it was comparatively successful. But in that case, management, the technology worked beautifully. The market was excellent for what it did. And had we been able to, the management was both stubborn and finally fell off the horse in that case. And I caught the aberration they were involved in, made them stop, but it wasn't soon enough. They'd gotten in deep trouble. Infuriating part about it was that the accountants knew it all along, but they basically were involved in premature revenue recognition, which has happened with so many computer companies. And we have been told, I won't name names, but we've been told others that were very involved in this. And this management team had worked at a place that had been heavily involved in premature revenue recognition. And of course, Gary's had painful experience in that area also, later on, much later on. But it was clear to me, we got into this company, and when we went in, computers were based on core memories. Then soon after we got in, the integrated circuit was developed and the microprocessor. Well, it was clear quickly that the microprocessor was going to make a smaller computer readily available and practicable. And from my earlier, the work we were talking about as we walk through here, about the computer modeling and so on, to me it was clear from the beginning there would be a large market for a lot of these things. And we must have looked at 25 personal computer companies. My young partner used to get a sample and take it home and have his children play with it. And most of these had what at the time seemed to be more experienced and better looking managements than Apple. And we were a little put off by the stories about Apple, that the two Steves were seen pretty much as kids at that point. So we didn't make an early round in Apple. But it became clear to me looking further that despite all these other 24, Apple was going to be the winner. For whatever reason, they were going to win. So we made a conscious effort to get into Apple at that point. And we talked, in those days, Mike Markkula and Mike Scott were running it. The Steves were not as important in the activity. Steve Wozniak had designed a very good and very simple machine. And you weren't seeing a lot of Steve Jobs at that point. We didn't have a lot of contact with Steve. Markkula was very sensible, and I think Markkula made a great contribution to the early stage. And he was one of the people that, as far as we could tell, genuinely did not want to be president. He did not want to be chief executive. When he invested, I think Don Ballantyne introduced him as an investor, and he came in really as an angel investor. And he agreed. He came with him as a vice president of marketing, and he agreed he would pick the president, and he picked Mike Scott, who had worked for him. Scott came in as president, and Markkula would do the marketing job for the month, and then once a month at a board meeting he'd put his chairman's hat on and act as chairman, and that ran pretty well. And Scott ran quite well up to where Apple was doing about $250 million in revenues. And then at that point, something unclear went wrong, and Scott was out. And then Markkula just never wanted to be president. He was president briefly and so on, but he was one of these honest people that just didn't like the job, didn't want the job, and didn't feel he was a man for it. And so when we found out about it in about this period, we found they were doing, some stock was available. We bought it up, we bought some stock from people. We paid what was at that time a very high price for it, and others were looking at it, and other very good firms out here who knew it as much as we did, or should have, felt it was just too expensive and wouldn't buy in. I was convinced that the market was going to get very big and that Apple was going to be the winner, and I wanted to be riding a winner and that I'd make money at it. And we bought stock from people. I've forgotten how we got it all, but I'd missed a round in there earlier, I think, where probably Art Rock went in, and I think Art made a lot more money. I'm sure he made a lot more money out of it than we did, because I think he got it at about a fifth to a tenth the price. But I just saw that, I felt rightly or wrongly, it was going to have a big future, big market, and I was more convinced. A lot of the people in the computer business, as you know, have been very wrong. Tom Watson was famous for saying there'd only be a few computers sold. Ken Olsen said there's room for many computers, but nobody will ever want a personal computer. Gordon Moore said, what would you do with a home computer? Would my wife keep her recipes on it? That's in his writing. So these people were all just wrong in judging the size of the market, which is very common. The major reason Henry Ford isn't in Cleveland today is because the patent cartel that controlled automotive patents in Cleveland knew he wanted to make a low-priced machine. They felt that automobiles, well, there would only be a few automobiles sold and they needed to be high-priced to be profitable. So they froze him out. He went to Dearborn and built his factory there, violated their patents and litigated back and forth until he had way more money than they did, and they gave up. So the ability of founders to guess how big their market's going to be is not very good.
Let me ask you one final question in this section, then we'll take a short break, and I want to come back to your policy work with the ERISA Prudent Man change and that. Did you find that what's the right word? I want to ask you a question about comparing the kind of entrepreneur you found in the Midwest, Michigan, Florida, with the kind of sensibility and orientation of an entrepreneur here in California, because we've never really, you're the first venture investor who could ever make that kind of comparison that we've taken an oral history of at this point. And maybe you're going to say, you know, there really is no difference. An entrepreneur is an entrepreneur. But I'm just interested in whether people you encountered in California, Silicon Valley, the way they thought was different qualitatively from the entrepreneurs you encountered in other areas.
Well, I think first, it's harder to generalize about entrepreneurs or try to fit them into one category than I don't think that way. I mean, I don't think there is a breed of entrepreneurs as such. I take a look at the whole situation, and everything is a situation. I mean, life is a series of situations, and how you do is what kind of situation you find and how you cope with it. You have, and I've seen entrepreneurs in all shapes and sizes and different categories, and some are very good in one area. They're usually one-sided in one form or another. The things I try to make sure of is that, again, that three-legged stool to me is just absolutely paramount. I have heard people say repeatedly, "Oh, he's wonderful, I'd back him in any business." I think that's nonsense. There are a whole hell of a lot of businesses I wouldn't back him or her or the other one in. They're not fitted to that situation. So I'm saying, what's this situation? What's this market? What's needed? And can this person do it? Will this person do it? Are they motivated? Will they stick to it? Will they have I remember two kids that came to me right at the beginning of my career and said, "We have some ideas for competing in the computer field, more or less competing with IBM." And they were sent in by, one of them was the son of a friend of mine, and, "Well, we'd like to see what you think of our doing this." And I said, well, we talked about it a bit, and they were very loose on it. And I said, "Well, if I turn you down on this, what are you going to do next?" "Oh, well, we think we'll go to Paris and we'll go into something completely different, or go to INSEAD or something as a school." Had no stick-to-itiveness. I want somebody that is going to be in there, hanging in there, where they're really attached to the idea and they really mean to see it through. And that drive, that, as I teach entrepreneurs often in leadership, you need a sense of, and you have to convey to your people, a sense of implacability. You need to use the current. You had Steve Jobs was going to kill him, but he'd get his way done. He was absolutely implacable in terms of what he got out of his team, and he didn't care who he killed in the process. Well, you need a bit of that in terms of your people feeling that, by God, this guy is going to see this through. You need, do they know what they need to know to do the job? And sometimes that's a lot of technical knowledge. Are the judgments any good? It's just a whole series of things that, do you think this man or this woman can cope with this situation? Are they married to it? Will they stick with it? Will they, do they know enough to do this? What we find about the Midwest, partly, mostly, the misunderstanding between the two, I think, is that so many of the Midwestern entrepreneurs are not deeply steeped in the industry knowledge. They don't have Gary's 40 years at this point, or back 20 years ago, they don't have a Gary's deep knowledge of the industry. Granted, that's more needed for a chief technical officer, perhaps, than a CEO. I've been pretty successful in several fields where I didn't have a deep industry knowledge, but one of the things I've learned when I go to a new industry, one of the things that I kind of hate about changing, and I wish my life had been a little different in that area, is that I find that generally I have pretty good judgment, but I just hate the first 2 years in a new industry because my own personal judgment isn't worth a damn. I don't know enough about the industry and I think this guy is giving me baloney, but I don't know enough for sure, and I have to ride on his knowledge and his recommendations until I know the industry well enough. I can substitute my judgment for his. You give me 5 years in my history at least, you give me 5 years in industry and I'll easily be a director of the trade association. But the first couple of years, my judgment isn't worth a damn. And I'm used to my judgment being pretty good. So you gotta know a certain amount to have your judgment be worth something. I think you get a lot of, particularly in young and inexperienced entrepreneurs, you get a lot of superficial, I want this, I want that, I want the other thing in it. And I think it's more subtle than that. I don't think it's that simple. I think, if they're not attached to the situation, like my young friends that were going to go to Paris, they're whole knockout factors. If you've got a very idealistic, clean American boy joke one of the jokes of the early years was the guy would come into a venture capitalist, and venture capitalist says, tell me about some of your policies that you plan to practice. And the young entrepreneurs say, well, I'm just a good, clean American boy. All I want is an equal chance, and I'm willing to work hard and give it a really good try. And my pricing, all I want is a fair profit on my profit, and so forth. And all I want is just a good American all-around chance. And a good experienced venture capitalist will say, out. What I want is an unfair advantage. What I want is a comparative edge over some other people. I want to have it locked up. I want to do a Warren Buffett. I want a moat around it. I want it just as hard for the competitors as possible. My attitude is the competitor's fair share of this market is zero. I'll get every bit I possibly can. How do I price? I'll charge what the traffic will bear. If I can charge a little more and I leave money on the table. One of the stories I love to tell about the aircraft business was I had a negotiation every year with Pratt & Whitney. I was the vice president and chief salesman on the account, and I negotiated every year on the price we were selling them about the nozzles. And we were told by them very reasonably, it was under renegotiation at that time, at the end of the year, we would have our profits audited by federal auditors. And if we had made more than they regarded as a fair profit, we were renegotiated and they took back some money, and the government took that money back directly. We charged it through Pratt & Whitney or GE or one of the other manufacturers, but the government would take it back. They would not give it back to Pratt & Whitney or whatever because they had the attitude, it's our money and Pratt & Whitney should have negotiated better and we'd just take it back directly. Well, we were told, Pratt & Whitney said, if you're making too much money, we Pratt & Whitney never are because we're way below it. So we can always use money back. So if you're making too much money, we'll be angry at you for negotiating too much, but you won't get fired if you give it back to us. But if you don't give it back to us and you get renegotiated, then the federal government will take it. We won't get it, and that we won't forgive you. You go down or out as a supplier if they let that happen. So we believed them. We believed we had to give them. We had to renegotiate. Well, I conducted a very good negotiation with this purchasing agent, and he was just God. He would control so much of our production, and he was buying what today would be billions of dollars of material and from people. And those were days that things were pretty hard on salesmen and people coming in. Well, I negotiated the first of the year, and we had a strong argument about it, and I made my prices stick. At the end of the year, our accounting people came to me and said, "Dave, we're making so much money. We've got to turn a substantial amount back. We are making twice as much as we're going to be allowed to keep. Even we stretch it as much. We've got to give a big chunk back." Well, I didn't like what I was going to go through, but I got credit memos, went in and called on the purchasing agent and said, "Earl, we found we're doing better, much better than we expected this year. Our costs are better. We're going to have to give you a refund on a lot of this." The refund was half our profit, and we still were pushing it all we possibly could. And he said, "How much is it?" So I showed him and he looks up and starts off, "God damn you, Morgenthaler," and it went down from there, and the profanity went down from there. He said, "I told you you were making too much." So that was the environment of the day. These were the 1950s, and when purchase agencies were God. And he just had he been able to shut us off, it would have been just practically death for our company. But those were, you get those circumstances. It's a very personal, and you're asking about entrepreneurs, but you got people, can they cope with that? Can they smell the situation? Can they? I took over the pricing function because when I was brought in as president of this little company, the manufacturing people were very afraid of letting salespeople have pricing function. I said, "You just tell me the lowest price I can't go below, and don't cheat on me. Be honest with me, and tell me the lowest price. I will get you more than that, but don't give me this. You're trying to guess. You don't know the customers. You're not dealing with them. I know what I can get." And so I got them to trust me completely because I always got more for the product than they were willing to take for it. And I think you're looking for all those rules and all those things, but to me, it's a judgment, a subjective judgment on the part of the venture capitalist. Can this guy do that? Can this guy cope with the situation? I think I got very deeply into, as Gary indicated, group dynamics and sensitivity training back in the 60s. I used it as a device and became very aware of its imperfections as well as its important things. But and I learned in that everything is very situational. And I got interested in intelligence testing, and I read Howard Gardner's book out of, Gardner's book? You're familiar with that?
Yes.
Frames of Mind, the Theory of Multiple Intelligences?
Yeah, multiple intelligences especially.
Well, I read that. It's an imperfect book in a lot of ways. It's very repetitious and so on. But I went up to Harvard and spent an afternoon with Howard and said, "I'm trying to develop some thoughts about the qualities that are useful, practical, in judging venture capitalists and the kinds of intelligence that they need. And I want to come up with some intelligence. I've taken yours and I've convinced them, and tell me what you think." And Howard was very reasonable. He agreed. First, you could subdivide his 7 into a lot more if you wanted to get down into details. And secondly, 3 or 4 of those didn't apply very much to what I was doing. But I came down to where you ought to think about people in three ways. You ought to think about them as thing smart, people smart, and situational smart. Now, what do I mean? Thing smart is usually school bright. I mean, you go in there, you learn new things fast, complicated fast, but the emphasis is on the word things. Nothing to do with people. Thing smart people are most venture capitalists, not everyone I've met, but most venture capitalists are pretty thing bright. They just don't get into business. You don't get into a top school like Harvard or MIT or Yale or one of those schools if you aren't thing bright enough, as a rule. Maybe if you're in, what's the word, you're a young Bush going in following your father, but
Legacy.
A legacy type person. But mostly it's people bright. I mean, it's thing bright. The trouble that we find in this business repeatedly is that all the extremely people bright people, all the extremely thing bright people feel they are people bright, and they're not. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And the people bright guys remind me of a psychologist that I hired, I used to screen a lot of people. He was a little gray man. No personality, no impacting with people or something, but he'd sit and talk to you. He'd interview you for about an hour, and he'd give you the most accurate appraisal of the individual that you ever saw. He was a wonderful interviewer and screener. He was a lousy group dynamics trainer. His interacting with people was nothing. He was just mush. But reading you like a charm. And he wasn't that thing bright. I wouldn't have used him in complicated math or semiconductor manufacturing or something. And then there is situational sensitivity, which to me is the greatest of all. That's the high-grade street smarts. That's the kid that smells money. One of my partners said about me something that I've always been pleased about and tried to live up to. I don't say I've made it, I just try to do it, aspire to it. He said, you can be working on business plans and you can show one to Dave and you look at it. If he doesn't smell money in it, you can't interest him in the thing. He can say, work on it if you want to, but I'm busy on something else. If he doesn't smell money, if he smells money in it, then you can go get back. Well, it's that smell for money. It's that sense that this is what they'd buy a lot of if I had it. This is what I need to do. This is how that person's going to react. This is the street kid that walks down the street, sees a dark alley on the side there and thinks, oops, I go past that, somebody is liable to reach out and crack me. I cross the street. It's that smell for trouble. And so I look for all I can find. And the biggest trap I find is, Gary and I have often talked about this, is the people, the thing smart people, which we have in plenty, think they're so smart about people, and they are so hard to convince that they aren't. And so they don't use enough resources to check on them. They don't go find my little gray man psychologist that really reads people well, though they'd run rings around him on learning new complicated things, or God help him if he had to analyze something complicated in a computer problem, but he reads people. And so that was, and to me it's an aggregate of that. You get in there and you find people that are just, some of them are just so situationally dumb. You have this kind of, how could they do that? I mean, one of the questions that often comes up in an experienced venture capital group is, what were they thinking when they did that? You wonder, how the hell would anybody reach those kind of conclusions that they would do that kind of thing? I saw a lawsuit recently. A man sued an entrepreneur. If I'd been in his situation suing that entrepreneur would have lost so completely. But this guy, working with his lawyer, went at this in such a dumb way that he lost it and got his suit thrown out, got countersued, and got charged several $1 million in settling the countersuit, just because of a very dumb way of going at it. And you find so much of that.
That's a great answer, I think, on that score. Yeah, you said a lot about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs, I think, with that whole answer. That was very good. I wanted to just cover your work in Washington on a couple of levels. First of all, there's a kind of natural allergy to Washington that I find out here in California in particular. Nobody really wants to have anything to do with it. In fact, the more at bay you can keep it, the happier everybody is. But you understood it. I mean, it seems to me you long understood the relationship between Washington policy and the effect on venture investing and entrepreneurship in California. And you not only understood it, but you were attracted to it. You wanted to play a role and actually see some change made. And I would like for you to talk a little bit about why you took that approach and what was attractive to you and how you found working through all of these very complicated issues in Washington.
Okay. Well, I've always had a mild interest in how we were governed. I never wanted the life of a politician. I never wanted to be constantly running for office, and I didn't want a lot of the living with the type of people and other things of that sort, but I am vitally concerned at how you govern things. And the fundamental way that I think always on any problem, and I think a lot of this defines me, is when I hear about a problem, the president did this or the president did that or didn't do this, so-and-so has this position. The first thing I'd term is the last thing I want is this blind prejudice. I want, first of all, and my thinking on it is, what would I do if I were leading the organization, whatever it is, and I had to solve this problem? What would I do? And if I can't find all that good an answer to it, though I'm no fan of Obama's, if I can't find all that good an answer to it, then I better view what Obama is doing a little differently. I mustn't have this blind antipathy to him. Sometimes he's right, sometimes he's wrong. What's the situation? What's the reality? I mean, reality is a big word to me. And what is this situation is a big word to me. And so often people see the situation the way they want to see it, not the way it really is. And that so often, and I'm constantly struggling to find what is the situation, even if I don't like what I know I may not like what I'm going to find, but I got to deal with the way it is. I've got to deal with the facts that are there. There are always a set of inanimate facts that anybody dealing with the problem has to deal with those. The speed of light is the speed of light. It doesn't give a damn whether you feel this way about it. I'm always a little amused about the scientists that feel that I think they fundamentally don't understand their education when they're saying that a phenomenon in nature, and we write an equation that describes it, and our equation works well until we get to certain situations, and then nature turns left and the equation didn't predict it. And nature's wrong. You're a damn fool. If nature doesn't follow your equation, you better rewrite your equation. That was one of the best things MIT taught me, that don't have your theory as what will work, and then when reality proves different, then deny it and stick to your, and I find so often this is true. I find people often that come in and say, I will prove to you conclusively, scientifically, there is no God. Or I will prove to you scientifically, conclusively, there is a God. And I've said, all you have just proven is you're no scientist. If you were a competent scientist, you'd simply say, there isn't remotely enough evidence. You've got 5 senses and the perception. I will agree with you that the Bible seems like a collection of a lot of legends, and it's pretty hard to believe every word that's in the Bible as such, and to believe the world was created in 6 days and so on. But you have to remember this was written by people 300 years after Christ, And God knows what was done and put into that. But this is the work of man. Man's very imperfect. You just don't know in regard to this. Maybe there's an alternative universe. That seems silly? Well, take a savage in the middle of the jungle and tell him there are radio waves passing through him, passing through him and around him all the way through there. And you can hear what has just passed through him out of this little black box in your pocket radio. He'll think you're out of your mind. But there's a reality here you just don't know about. We don't know about. I haven't heard come up with a really good explanation for black holes in society at this stage. To me, it's get to reality. And these people that seem to me to be so foolish, and we found a lot of this in the NVCA. After we did such a good job of getting the capital gains tax rolled back and educating Congress on this, and we walked the halls for weeks. And we were told, forgive me if I'm being repetitious on this, but I've talked to several people about it lately, and I'm not sure what I said and what I didn't, but we went in. I haven't told you how it got started, I don't think. Pardon? I told John?
No, we haven't talked about any of this before.
Well,
you and I.
what happened was that Ned Heiser raised a large fund in 1968, about the time Intel got started. Ned raised, I recall it was around 70 million. It could have been 60, it could have been 80, but it was within plus or minus 10 million. He had been running venture investing for Allstate Insurance. And Ned raised this very large fund, and he had a concept that he was going to staff his venture firm like a business. In other words, he was going to have people for marketing and people for technical, and really staff it the way you would a business. That proved to be that concept didn't work at all well. But at the same time, Ned, that 60 million fund or 70 million fund was much bigger than most of us. He decided we ought to have an association. And venture capitalists had been very much opposed to that kind of thing before. Whitney and American Research had no love for each other. And both were, General Dorio rightly went after financing bright young men out of technical places. That's what Dr. Compton and Ralph Flanders wanted him to do. And he raised 6 or 8 million publicly and was going to finance bright young technical ideas. Well, he didn't do the DEC investment until 1957, as I recall. He'd been in business since late 45 or early 46. And he hadn't had a lot of success. One of my classmates worked for one of his company, which I think was Ionics or something, and that was about the most success. But he was financing technology startups and without very experienced managers. And Ken Olson and his team came out of Lincoln Laboratories, as I recall, and they were all technologists as such. I don't think they had much management background. Well, Whitney and Dorio were like that. And then you had Bessemer, which of course was the old Henry Phipps money out of Carnegie Steel, was in operation. You had, and then you had the Rothschild money in here in, I've forgotten the name of it, Charlie Lay's company. Charlie was the second president of NVCA. Pardon? Newcourt, exactly, yeah. And you had a few like that, but there were a limited number. Well, Ned rounded up all these people. I think what Ned really had in mind was that he wanted to develop what he called a business development company, that category. None of the rest of us were thinking particularly in that area, but we liked the idea of an association. Well, we got together and formed, and of course elected Ned. Ned had by far the biggest fund, and we elected him president. But Ned kind of worked a little independently of the association. he got us together, but then he sort of went off and did his own lobbying for business development. One of our earliest meetings was in San Diego. I think Dave Dunn, who came out of Whitney, was involved in that, if I recall correctly. And I remember how our activity got started, which was we were sitting in a director's meeting, I believe in San Diego, and a guy by the name of Dick Hanshin, who was running about a $6 million fund that he had gotten out of the Stevens investment banking firm out of Little Rock, had asked Dick, we were talking about what we were going to do, and somebody said, well, let's form an association, let's get together, outings and resorts, and play golf. And we said, oh, we already got too much of that already, we can't spend any more time on it. And then somebody else said, let's get together and fix the price of deals on what we offer entrepreneurs, we'll just collude when the thing goes around there. Some of us, I've said this to some, one of my first directors when I first became a president had been Assistant Attorney General of the United States. And I got he gave me a lot of free education on antitrust problems. He was always concerned we were going to get into an antitrust problem. It was a big lawyer and a little company. And I'd say, John, I'd be so flattered if I've got about 1% of the market, if it had an antitrust problem, it'd be the best thing in the world for me if somebody'd sue me. But he wanted to help, but he was way up here and we were way down here. But I said, there are very real antitrust problems, and fixing prices on things is not something we're going to be involved in. The government does not take that very kindly. So I'm not sure the guy was too serious anyway, but that went away. And then Hanshin got up and said, we do things we support these little guys, we start these companies, we take losses and risks and so on. We ought to get Congress to give us something for this. So they ought to recognize this. And instead we realized that when I went into business, the capital gains tax rate was 25%. This was 72, 73 that I'm talking about in the time frame here. The rate had gone up to 48, 49% at that point. It had just crept up there. Most of us hadn't even noticed it. We weren't making enough capital gains or cashing them in to be as concerned about it, but it had crept up there. And they'd made offerings harder and that sort of thing. Hanshin said, I would go to Washington and work on this and try to get Congress to give us something if you'd help me. He turned to me. And I said, yeah, I would do that. I've never had a Washington experience. I've always been interested. And I don't know anything about it, but I would be glad to do it. And it was, in a way, it's a salesman's type job. It's an educator's lobbying. Good lobbying is education. And so I said, I'll help. So we proposed that to the group, and they eagerly snapped it up because somebody else was willing to do some work. And we volunteered, and we go down to Washington. And Hanshin, I think, had heard that there was a lobbying lawyer who worked for Nelson Rockefeller. And so we called this guy and said, we're representing this trade association. We're co-chairman of the incentives committee, and we want to talk to Congress about improving the tax legislation and some of the other conditions for Washington. Well, like any good lawyer, he's looking at the business, but he hears we're venture capitalists, and he's gotten Nelson Rockefeller as some kind of a client, and he knows Nelson is a venture capitalist. So that was enough that he'd take us on. And we had so piddling little money. I mean, I think we were going to spend about $15,000 a year, most of which we had to put up, and a firm spend that on a small party now. But that was what we had to work with, and none of us had very much money. So we deal with him for a little while. The only thing that I can recall his doing that was of any use whatever was he said, you guys are an industry, you should be allowed to testify as an industry. we'll get you a hearing before Lloyd Benson's Joint Economics Committee. So he got us a hearing, and we went in to testify before Congress. Green as grass. Well, we went out with one of his lawyers. The guy didn't know where to park. The guy walked into these. We called on a number of senators, and one or two of them said, well, we haven't, I mean, the receptionist said, well, I haven't seen you in a long time, or who are you, to the lawyer, and so forth. Clearly, they had no entree and so forth. And I told Dick later, I said, Dick, I'm an old sales manager at this point, and if all I know is this is a sales job, and this lawyer is a salesman that doesn't know the territory. He has no touch whatever with his customer. When you don't know where to park, you're not calling on these people very often. So at any rate, we got this opportunity to testify. We had the theory that these congressmen were naive, and they just didn't know about business. So we started out to explain. We found out that very quickly that a number of them knew about business, they just didn't like it. We had a different selling problem. And we had been at first, we readily equated ourselves with the New York boys, and we were friendly with them. And I went to Whitney, and I went to Rockefeller, and we were friends, and said, we'd like to have some support from you and some money and some help in getting this. They said, Dave, you're out of your mind. You're going to Congress, and you're asking them to reduce Jock Whitney's taxes. You're asking them to reduce Nelson Rockefeller's taxes. You think you can get that done? You're crazy. No, we won't give you a dime. And Whitney always had a very nice attitude toward me because I'd made him a lot of money. And I've never found anybody that I've made a good deal of money for that doesn't like me. Somehow people are like that. But so we went away sadly, and we discovered then, well, Henshin and I said, well, we're a couple of country boys. I'm this little guy from Cleveland using his own money, and Dick's this little guy from Texas at the small fund here, and we're helping these entrepreneurs. And so Congress, we quickly had ourselves as good guys, and we start making the rounds and educating them, and we start in, and then I was pushing for electing the presidents of the bigger funds, the heads of the bigger funds, presidents of NVCA, because I was very sure that if the big guys dropped out, the little guys weren't going to come anymore. So the little guys were flocking in because the big guys were there. I would have liked to be president, but I didn't want the honor. I was too small to really want it. So we elected, Ned was the first president, and then Charlie Lay of Newcourt supposedly had the second biggest fund, so we made him second president. Then Pete Bancroft was head of venture for Bessemer, which supposedly had the third largest, so we made Pete president. Well, unfortunately, very quickly, and they made me vice president at that point. And very quickly, Pete got promoted to head all of Bessemer. The guy that had been head of the whole firm had screwed up in some kind of real estate investment or something, and they put in, Pete's a pretty good man, and they put Pete in to head the whole thing. And Pete said, Dave, I'm not going to be able to do very much. You're going to have to, I'm so busy with this, I can't help much. But one thing he did do was that he headed a paper on emerging small business and endangered series, and an endangered specimen or whatever. And Pete pretty well supervised the writing of it. Some of us helped in it. He got that done. Then I was doing most of the going to Congress. Henshin by then had quickly decided that what he wanted to do was buy a company for his family, buy it and run it, and he dropped out. But I continued with the program, and I was still interested. And I was enjoying talking to congressmen, and as I said, it's a sales and educational job, and I was spending a little time on it, learning and helping and becoming more clear all the time, because we were able to make the case to Congress that we said we're not alleging any conspiracy, but if you wanted to get together with big business and strangle small business, you do just about the things you've done. And the congressman said, we're not that smart, but we see your point. And we kept on. And the other thing they didn't realize was that we pointed out, most of the new jobs are being created by small and innovative businesses. The big companies are not hiring. They're starting to lay off people. They're going overseas. Everybody caters to the big companies, but they're not where your future is, because they're going to be all over the world. It's moving toward the global industry. Well, we kept on pushing that and pushing it, and going to see these people, and we got legislation introduced. I wrote a model bill. I got a senator that agreed he would write the proper bill for this, and he introduced it, and nothing happened. I learned the difference between any fool can get a bill introduced in the Senate. Getting it passed is you got to get behind it and push, and so
it's
we
like
got
the old civics lesson, right? How a bill becomes law.
Absolutely, and the practicalities of it. Well, we got round and round, but I discovered a marvelous thing. We didn't have much money, but I discovered if you testify before a committee and you submit some written remarks, they will print them up in large quantities. So the government became our free printing press, because I went everywhere I could, spoke at everything I could get into, introduced this emerging paper, and it got all over Washington. And after a while, we got back to, we were going in to see a congressman for the first time, and he said, do you know? And he's quoting from our paper, and all the facts that we had. Oh, is that right? And he's quoting back to us what we've told him. And that went on, and finally it was an idea. The capital gains tax was just an idea whose time had come. My bill that I would have, and I'd worked with the Treasury, and the Treasury was very cooperative, and I was able to sell them on the narrow idea that financing small, high-growth companies was a very worthwhile idea, financing almost inventions and innovations. That was an excellent idea. I didn't give a damn about supporting real estate. I didn't give a hoot really about supporting even a lot of consumer type things. I wanted to support technology-oriented companies, and I was perfectly willing to go for a holding period longer than a year, because we were all always locked up for 4 or 5 years anyway. We had that all in the bill. Nothing happened. But then when the other people came in to get the support of the real estate people and the others, we had to go to the 1-year holding period. Which is fine with us, but it just doesn't make, very few venture capital firms are able to liquidate within a year anyhow, so it's almost.
It didn't hurt you, right?
It didn't hurt us, but it didn't help any.
Yeah.
And we made a lot of other people. And now Warren Buffett is trying to undo all that. And I would have accepted a much narrower law. And the capital gains rate came down from 49, we got it down to 28. And somebody, I think, brought it to 25, and then Bush, then I've forgotten whether there was a 20 in between, then Bush got it down to 15. So that was it. And
then what about ERISA? Did that give you confidence that you could go in and make this other change?
Yes, and other people in the firm were very interested. Several people worked on it. Lionel Pincus worked extensively, and Warburg Pincus was raising a good deal of that kind of money. And the people that were, I did not work as extensively on the ERISA portion, or I didn't do much on it personally, but that was part of the effort of the NVCA. We were able to marshal that. And then there were some changes in the SEC laws that had made it more difficult for offerings, and somebody worked on those, and we got it changed.
And that really was a sea change for venture.
Oh, yes.
At that point, wasn't it?
Well, the first two were the important ones, really. But then the change with the SEC made liquidity much easier.
Let me talk to you finally, just for maybe 5 minutes or so, about choosing a life in philanthropy and your commitment to nonprofit work and community service, especially in Cleveland. You've been so involved in that for so long. Why is that important to you? I
guess it's the way you were raised. I've had I had a Southern Protestant education, I guess, and I had some idea about service. I felt that you could be of more service to the world if you'd made some money to be of service with. So I was always interested in making money. And as I said, I treasure that comment that you can't get Dave interested in it if he won't make any money. I like that. I mean, if that were totally true. Beyond that, I kind of like to do good. I like to give back. The world's been, on balance, pretty good to me. I didn't inherit anything. And I just was given opportunities, and which I pretty well took advantage of. I like to give back. I like to try to make this a better world. And it's a little naive. If you ask me what has been one of my major deficiencies in life, I'd say I've been a little too nice a guy. You don't find a lot of people that agree with that, incidentally, but I would sort of say I'm too nice a guy. On the other hand, I'm a realist, and I understand very fully one of the things that the world has turned into in particular is that if you are a mean, stupid, hard to get along with, terrible, dumb, miserable person, and you have a lot of stock in a company that does extremely well, you're a very successful venture capitalist in the eyes of our limited partners today. If you are a wonderful, loving, kind, happy, intelligent, ideal human being in this, and you don't have any stock in anything that does very well, you don't cut much ice in getting support from your limited partners. So it is not so much the kind of guy you are as it is, do you have stock in something that wins? So the first thing is to make sure you get in something that's going to win. The second thing is do all you can to add value to it and make it more likely that it's going to win. And beyond that, there's not much else. The philanthropy, I think most of us, in one way or another, we'd like to do some good. We'd like to feel the world's a little better. One of my other failures has been, and one of my characteristics that I try to tell our children is, I think you do people a favor if you are willing to admit your failures or your disappointments and that sort of thing. And I feel that if you're secure enough, you're willing to do that. I'm lucky to feel that I won a few more than I lost, so I can afford to be honest. I have a horror of saying something where I've taken credit that other people deserve, and I've tried in this conversation with you to tell you who really did what. I didn't found NVCA, Ned did. I mean, Ned was the guy. I've tried for years to get NVCA to give Ned a founder's medal and give the rest of us co-founders medals, and people jokingly often said, "Why I practically founded venture capital." I didn't. That's wrong. My contribution in building up NVCA and in getting the capital gains tax rolled back, which drew so many more people into the business, which drew money into it, may have been one of the greatest contributions of all time to venture capital. In terms of the poster boys for the greatest venture capitalists, probably Tom Perkins is the poster boy. You got a lot of, I don't think you'd get agreement on the West Coast as to who was the greatest venture capitalist. And again, it's who had stock in the big winners. And you have a lot of quiet guys that may have made more money than any of us, I don't know. But I've enjoyed the doing good. I've enjoyed the ability to leave the world a better place. I tried to set a good example for my children. I'm proud of my children. And nobody's perfect. I'm certainly not. I wouldn't hold them out as perfect, but I think they're way above average, and pretty good guys. And I just enjoy making things better. And I wish, one of my disappointments I started to say, and I said, went off on that, I'm willing to admit it. I had hoped, as kind of a crowning cap, that I would have some part in curing a major disease. And several of my life sciences investments I got involved in with the hope we could do that, and always with what we thought was good evidence that there was a good gamble that we could do it. And the last company that I retired from as chairman after almost 10 years had 3 drugs that looked as if, in phase 1 trials, that looked as if they could cure or alleviate major, very high volume worldwide diseases. None of the 3 worked out. The company later, after I had retired, later was found to have a technology that was so valuable in a different species than we'd been working, a different area than we'd been working, that Merck paid $1.5 billion for the company, or $1.25 billion for the company, and bought the company. So we were not wasting our time. But that need that Merck saw for its technology had not come along before, and the medicines it had developed were unsuccessful during my career, and the rest after this. So I go to my grave without having cured a major disease. I'd just like for the satisfaction to have done that, to contribute something to it. But we have some successes and some failures, and you could have a big ego about this, but if you're realistic, you all too often you face up to the fact that you do your best, but you put medicine in people and you don't know what it's going to do until you run your clinical trials. You just do not know what a medicine will do until it's tested in people. A joke I use regularly is that if rats had any purchasing power, I'd be a billionaire, because I've cured so many rats, or been part of curing so many rats. But that's, and I like to do the things that help a region be better. I've lived in the Midwest most of my career. I have a very large part of that I have been part of the international business community, rather than, I've never been a local businessman as such. I've always been at least a national businessman. People used to ask what I did for the community, and my wife is civically very active and served on college boards and a number of things, and did a lot of things for the city. I said simply, her name's Lindsay, I said, what do? I donate Lindsay's time. So for a long time, till I started to step down in this, I was mostly business preoccupied, except for hospitals. I've been a hospital trustee for over 40 years. I was 12 years on a community hospital, and then I've been on the clinic board about 30 years. So, and I continue. Now I'm still very active on 2 National Academy of Science boards. We should call them committees, really, but they like to call them boards. Scientist somehow likes to say I'm a member of the board, and people think it's a board of directors, but we don't direct. We direct some of the work, or we influence some of the work, but we're certainly no board of directors. But I'm very active on those, and I headed a major study for the Science, Technology, and Economic Policy Board a couple of years ago, where we were studying global innovation systems. So I'm very interested in what promotes American innovation today. I think the solution we've absolutely got to have, and I focus on more to the degree than a lot of younger people do, what's next? What's the new thing that's coming? And if we don't keep that, then I think we're going to see America's predominance in the world slip away. And I'm extremely American from that standpoint. I still think we're a very imperfect country, doing a lot of very imperfect and very foolish things, but we're better than what's in second place that I've seen anywhere. We're not good, we're not perfect, but they're a lot worse. So I'm concentrating on trying to make America better, trying to make my region better. And I find so much of it is people just don't think clearly. They don't understand the kind of things we've been talking about, that this region was fruits and grapes and vegetables and that kind of thing, till it got to semiconductor. And it had to have some radio and some other things of that kind building up in it. I'm aware of DeForest and some of the others that were there, but that was your real driver. And also, you do have the culture and exchange of information, and Annalise Saxenian at Berkeley, I think, has written a superb book, a series of books, and she really understands why this region did better than the Boston region did. I think she's right on that. So I think that's probably what I would say to this. Any more questions? Have I? Anything?
You've covered it. This
Like
has
it?
been terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you, David,
Thank
for your
you.
generous amount of time and sharing so many of your personal stories.
Well, I hope it's worthwhile. I hope that.
Well, we take the long view of the museum. You know, I'm lucky. I've got a board that thinks we're going to be here for 250 years, and so
And you should.
when we take these oral
We
histories,
still study Columbus's voyages,
that's
don't
right. Well, we know how people would have loved to have sat down with Rockefeller or Carnegie or Mellon and heard from them personally, but we'll never have that opportunity. So what we're
No.
trying to do is create that opportunity and hold it for the next generation.
we? Well, you read those books, and I've read a great many, particularly about Carnegie, because my wife was the trustee and principal volunteer fundraiser for them, the head of their fundraising for many years. And she once asked if I would take her to call on Margaret Carnegie, Andrew's daughter, because they were running a drive and they wanted Margaret to be honorary chairman. So I said, yes, if you get me a couple books. So she did, and I read the books on the way, and then we called on Margaret Carnegie. And so I got interested in particular in Andrew Carnegie and the Pittsburgh stories. And my first job was in Pittsburgh after graduate school. No, it's a wonderful understanding, and I think you've had some remarkable and enlightened people out here. I don't know Gordon Moore, but I've read some of his writings, and I met Bill Hewlett. I didn't know Dave Packard, but they've been remarkable men. Of course, you've had many billions, well, into billions, thrown into the region, that money they produced. And people just don't realize the dynamic impact that it has on a region to throw a bunch of new millionaires into the region. And when I'm told, and I can't verify the number, that Google's public offering and subsequent action created 3,000 new millionaires. Well, we have a very highly developed philanthropic fundraising community around Cleveland. Our averages are much higher than the rest of the country. It is older money. We don't have a huge number of new millionaires in the area. My disappointment as a venture capitalist in Cleveland is not how many deals I've missed, it's how few. There are 2 deals over the last period of my time there that I really wish I'd done. One of which was carefully studied by 2 of my partners and turned down twice. And they turned it down for a flaw that they proved to be right on, but the company had attained $800 million in revenues before that manifested itself. The other one, the entrepreneur kidded me for years about not investing in him. I finally told him, I said, Mal, when you came along, I was using my own money, and I had just enough cash for one investment. I had a choice between you and another company. The other company was Apple. And with courtesy, I chose Apple. And he stopped kidding me.
It's hard to argue with that.